that larger scale stimulus is unlikely in the near term.
On the yuan, Roger, actually, we were seeing a little bit of yuan strength earlier, still holding above the 7 level, and we're kind of pairing that strength a little bit right now, but still at 701.26 on the offshore, 701.40 on the onshore. And chiming in on the state of trade is Ray Dalio. He warns China and the US could wind up in a capital war.
There's a trade war, there's a technology war, there is a geopolitical war, and there could be capital wars. And that is the nature of the environment. And how that's approached is going to determine what our futures are like.
The Bridgewater founder said he hopes for a win-win situation in the US-China trade conflict and that the two countries have different systems and one shouldn't expect to impose its way on the other.
And the Alibaba co-founder, Jack Ma, thinks trade turbulence between the US and China could persist for the next 2 decades.
I said USA and China relationship might be in some turbulence in 20 years. Next 20 years may last. We have to be very, very careful.
And in an exclusive interview with Bloomberg, Ma said that while a full-scale trade war might not last that long, relations could end up rocky, and he emphasized the importance of the two countries working together and sharing technology.
Despite repeating general concerns about trade uncertainty, Jerome Powell sounded mostly upbeat on his second day of congressional testimony. The Fed chair said there are few warning signs that the expansion or financial markets will get derailed.
The U.S. economy is the star economy these days. We're growing at 2%, right in that range, more than any of the other advanced economies are growing, and that's there's no reason to think that can't continue. So our forecast is, and our expectation is very much one of continued moderate growth, a strong labor market, and inflation, close to our 2% objective.
Powell's remarks reinforced the sense that officials have done enough to keep the economy on track after 3 rate cuts this year. And, we didn't only hear from Powell yesterday, Roger. I mean, one of the things that I think you could take away if you wanted to be on the side of, yes, they're pausing for the foreseeable, is the fact that Powell emphasized that he didn't really see many signs of sort of instabilities at the moment in the economy, that he saw it as a sustainable expansion. But also you had James Bullard, who's one of the most dovish FOMC members, his comments really signalling that it's a very high bar for a rate cut. And Robert Kaplan sounding pretty positive too.
Well, staying with central banks, the governor of New Zealand's central bank says rates need to stay low for a long time. In an exclusive interview with Bloomberg, Adrian Orr said the door was still open to further cuts.
We were very convinced that, one, these interest rates will have to stay low for a prolonged period of time, and two, we already have very stimulatory monetary conditions. So, in a sense, we've bought ourselves the opportunity to observe the data, watch this monetary stimulus work through the economy, and we are starting to see all of the signs we would expect to see of monetary policy being effective.
And that was the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Governor Adrian Orr.
Yeah, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Assistant Governor, by the way, Christine Hawkesby, said that February is a live interest rate decision, but there would need to be a material change in the economic outlook to warrant a rate cut. Those are your top stories. Let's get the world news with Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Good morning, Naira. Istanbul's new mayor says his election victory against Turkish President Erdogan's party carries a lesson for the world's populist leaders. Act against the will of the people you claim to represent, and you will lose it all. As a joint candidate for Turkey's opposition led by Republican People's Party CHP, Ekrem İmamoğlu beat Erdogan's candidate in March. He spoke to Bloomberg about his future ambitions.
There are years ahead of us. My only focus is to work very hard. If you work very hard without you making any plans, people already send you to where they think you fit. Right now, my only focus is to become very successful as a mayor of Istanbul.
Here in the UK, Boris Johnson is making a pitch for voters in overlooked towns. He is promising to revive high streets through tax breaks for local businesses and reopen provincial railway lines. Bloomberg's Alex Morales says Johnson was somewhat eclipsed by Corbyn's broadband promise.
The UK Prime Minister on Friday announced cuts to business rates for shops, pubs and cinemas and promised £500 million to help restore local rail networks that were cut in the 1960s. But his largesse was eclipsed by Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, who on Friday is set to outline plans to roll out free full-fibre broadband across the country, with a plan that includes nationalisation of BT's Openreach unit. In London, Alex Morales, Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.
China's President Xi Jinping says the most pressing task for Hong Kong is to end violence and restore order. Xi's comments were reported by state broadcaster CCTV as the city faces a fifth consecutive weekday of disruption and a second protest-led death in a week. The rare intervention came as the US Senate moved to expedite legislation that would support Hong Kong's pro-democracy protesters. And finally, an experimental ultra-long-haul flight from London to Sydney has now touched down after 19 hours and 19 minutes. People on board were mostly Qantas employees fitted with monitors. The data will be looked at by a medical institute in Sydney to examine how long-haul journeys actually affect our health. Global News 24 hours a day on air and at TikTok on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Jan Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Roger.
Leanne, haven't we done that thing, the Qantas, they had an earlier flight, didn't they?
Yes, you're right, and that was last month, but that wasn't London to Sydney, Roger. It was New York to Sydney. And guess what? This one was actually longer, a whole 3 minutes longer.
I bet it felt like that too.
19 hours, 90 minutes.
It's those 3 minutes that made all the difference.
It was those 3 minutes, that was it. And you remember, we had a Bloomberg reporter, that was Angus Whitley. He was on the New York to Sydney flight, and I feel like we kind of need to check in with him on
Check he's still all right.
Yes.
Has anyone called him?
No, quick, look him up.
If he's still alive, I might get on the next flight.
Leanne Gerrans, thank you so much. Up next, we hear from Maersk CEO as Maersk cut its outlook for container growth as the US-China trade war takes its toll on the industry. This is Bloomberg.
Startups and research universities like New Jersey Institute of Technology are fueling the innovation economy. And few people are better positioned to see what's on the horizon in New Jersey than physicist and state representative Andrew Zwicker.
How technology is transforming our financial sector is revolutionary, and so much of that is in New Jersey. We are innovators when it comes to agriculture, and there is opportunity now for great transformation in how are we going to grow food in an ever-growing population, and how do we turn urban centers into agricultural centers. Autonomous vehicles is another one where we have some of the world's leading experts, and how this will transform how those who are either elderly or are visually impaired or mobilely impaired can start to use autonomous vehicles to transform their lives and have access to transportation they could have never had before.
NJIT, New Jersey Institute of Technology. Learn more at njit.edu/research.
More than just a game, baseball is big business. For the chief revenue officer of the New York Mets, this means overseeing complex operations, key financial drivers, and interpreting data to make critical decisions every day.
How is your business managing complexity? Cohn Resnick can help you improve performance through an integrated business planning strategy that optimizes your data, streamlines processes, and keeps you ahead of the competition. Explore more at cohnresnick.com/MLB. Cohn Resnick, Advisory Assurance Tax. Transform your game.
The possibility of lung cancer can be pretty scary, especially if you're one of approximately 8 million current or former smokers at high risk. That's why SaveByTheScan.org wants you to know that now there's a breakthrough low-dose CT scan that can detect lung cancer early, and it only takes 60 seconds. You stop smoking, now start screening. For an easy quiz to see if you're eligible, visit SaveByTheScan.org. It could save your life. SaveByTheScan.org is brought to you by the American Lung Association's Lung Force Initiative and the Ad Council.
Influential conversations from Bloomberg Television. Here's Taylor Briggs.
A few former Uber employees have created a new startup, Virtual Kitchen. It's one of many entrants into the crowded field of companies renting kitchen space to restaurants desperate to satisfy demand from hungry homebodies. But it's particularly noteworthy that the founders came from Uber. Joining us to discuss the space, it is Ken Chong. He's the CEO of Virtual Kitchens. As we know, hugely crowded space. How do you stand out?
Thank you, Taylor. It's a pleasure to be here today. Food delivery is really popular. Consumers continue to love the convenience of it. And we talked to a lot of restaurateurs, and it turns out it's actually very challenging for restaurants who are built for dine-in first with a lot of seating. And so with Virtual Kitchen, we really are trying to make it seamless and turnkey for restaurateurs to expand delivery in a very simple way and with very little upfront costs. And of course, bring more selection and great food to more customers.
And you left Uber and Uber Eats in part because you saw the strain that the delivery apps were putting on those restaurants. How are you solving for that strain with your new virtual kitchen?
We build space, operations, and offer help on staffing, menu, and site selection to help them do the best delivery sort of product possible.
Hear more interviews like this one on Bloomberg Television, streaming live on Bloomberg.com and on the Bloomberg mobile app, or check your local cable listings.
Markets, headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app and at TikTok on Twitter. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg's European headquarters in London, I'm Sandra Kilhoff. Time for a Bloomberg Radio Business Flash. Now over to the First Word breaking news desk in Berlin. For today's morning call, here's Richard Jones.
Good morning, Sandra. Most Asian equities are traded higher today, reacting positively to optimistic White House comments on China-U.S. trade talks. The Nikkei 225 and Kospi traded higher with the Hang Seng flat. The Shanghai Composite traded lower by 0.6%, despite a liquidity injection by the PBOC. E-mini, S&P, and Nasdaq futures both trade higher by 0.3%. European equities have also opened up, with the Euro Stoxx 50, the DAX, the CAC 40 and FTSE 100 all up between 4 and 0.6%. Looking at the sector breakdown in Europe, gains are being led by basic resources, technology, and telecoms. Turning to bond markets, the U.S. 10-year yield is trading 1 basis point higher at 1.83%, which leaves the U.S. 10-year about 11 basis points lower this week in aggregate. The 10-year German Bund yield is 1 basis point higher at minus 0.34%, 8 basis points lower on the week. In the FX space, the Bloomberg Dollar Index is trading little changed, as are most of the major FX pairs. In terms of European data, we have Italy's trade balance, CPI, and government debt figures today, in addition to Euro area final CPI and European trade balance. For central bank speakers from the ECB, we get Costa, Pret, and Weidmann speaking today. That's it for me. For more macro breaking news, it's SQUA Go on the Bloomberg terminal. Sandra?
Thanks, Richard. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now here's Leanne Garens with more on what's going on around the world.
Sandra, thank you. A state of emergency has been declared in Venice as the historic city deals with the worst flooding in more than 50 years. There's anger from locals that a huge underwater defense barrier still hasn't been finished. Italy's Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte has chaired a special cabinet meeting after visiting the city. Bushfires continue to rage across much of eastern Australia and are clearly visible from space. At least 60 separate fires are burning in New South Wales, with 4 people known to have died. Residents in Queensland are being warned that weather conditions are expected to turn hotter and drier this weekend. And finally, Netflix is making changes to a Second World War documentary after a complaint from Poland. The country's Prime Minister says The Devil Next Door didn't make it clear that concentration camps in the country were run by the Nazis, not by the Poles. The streaming company says it's adding text to maps, which feature in the program. Global News 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok and Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Garens. This is Bloomberg Naira.
Leanne, thank you so much. Now to an earnings interview from this morning. AP Møller-Mærsk says it's less optimistic about growth as trade wars dent the economic outlook. The world's biggest container transport company says it now sees global growth in its industry of between 1 and 2%. That's down from a previous estimate of 1 to 3%. Earlier, Anna Edwards spoke to the CEO of Maersk, Søren Skou, and began by asking what he's trying to communicate to the markets with his outlook statement.
First of all, I'm trying to communicate that despite the weakness, we're having some fairly decent results. But secondly, it is very clear for global growth that it has come down a lot, and we can see that in the volume trade numbers. We believe they will come in when everything is said and done at about 1.5 percentage point of growth in the third quarter. That's not a lot, and it's obviously impacted by the trade tensions, the impact that has on business sentiment and confidence, despite the fact that consumer confidence actually is pretty high most places in the world today.
So what kind of impact, can you quantify the impact that the trade tensions are having on your company? Because sometimes your numbers have seemed resilient as in the face of these trends, the trade tensions then, Søren.
Yeah, so our operating earnings are up 14% compared to the same quarter last year. So of course we have been able to more than mitigate the low demand growth scenario by taking costs out and so on. But obviously for the world and for the global economy, it's not good news that we're not growing any faster than what we are. We will continue as a company to be very disciplined in terms of our capacity deployment, and that means we can keep our cost low, and therefore we also can continue to grow earnings, we believe, despite the fact that we're in a very weak growth scenario.
Yeah, where is this weakness showing up the most then, Soren? Where are the trade tensions showing up the most?
Clearly, most in the Pacific, so between US and Asia, where we might end up for the first time in many years with a market that overall have declined. We have seen all year, of course, that exports from China to the US have been down, but they have been outweighed by exports from Vietnam and Southeast Asia and so on to the US. But coming into the third quarter, we're seeing decline overall, and that is market, combined with also Latin America, where there's weakness for other reasons, in particular because of the economy there.
You've managed to offset weak demand in previous quarters, Soren, through improved capacity management. Lower fuel costs have helped, of course. How much can self-help measures really assist you?
Well, I think we can still do a lot to manage our business better. There's more to be done on the cost agenda, productivity. So I think we have our own fate in our hands.
And let me ask you about the, a little bit further on that then, technology-driven productivity gains, also something that I know helps in your industry. So where is it that you can still focus in terms of using costs, using self-help to tackle a slowdown?
So we have a couple of areas that are where we're using technology to lower cost. One is the way we transact with our customers. Today, Maersk.com is a website that transacts more than $20 billion in revenue per year. It's customer self-serving, basically getting price quotes, making bookings, and so on. And obviously, that's an efficiency gain for us. The other area is around the port automation, where we are using, Internet of Things technology to automate the machines that we operate. The same is going on the ships when it comes to fuel efficiency. So there are plenty of areas where we can use technology to take out costs and become more efficient.
That was Maersk CEO Soren Skov speaking to Bloomberg's Anna Edwards, and Maersk shares trading higher by 1.6% today, Roger.
And some more news breaking across the terminal within the past few moments. John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, Labour's finance spokesman, has been talking about Labour's plans to offer free broadband to all if they win the election, and particularly to their plans to nationalise the Openreach unit of BT as part of that. Now, McDonnell has said that they would pay government bonds as compensation to BT shareholders. They're also saying they're sure a working arrangement is possible with other telecoms companies, and that this would be part of a process to try and get this thing done. It's very interesting they're moving in this direction there, because clearly there's been a lot of alarm about this nationalisation idea. Yeah, and they did say as well, or McDonnell said, we aren't nationalising other companies, this is the limit, and emphasising we're not nationalising all of BT. 25 minutes into the equity market open here in Europe, we are still risk on after comments from Larry Kudlow on US-China trade. This is Bloomberg.
This is a Bloomberg Market Minute. Wall Street's string of 5 consecutive winning weeks is up for grabs as trading gets underway this morning. The market is higher for the week, but not by much, as uncertainty surrounding US-China trade talks keeps investors on edge. Trading starts with the Dow Jones Industrial Average at 27,781, up about 100 points for the week. The S&P and NASDAQ are slightly above last Friday's close. On the calendar this morning, the government reports on October retail sales. A modest gain is expected, reversing most of a September decline. JCPenney will report third-quarter earnings before the opening. Dollar Tree is in hot water with federal regulators. The FDA has sent the company a warning letter about drugs produced for its Assured brand label. The agency says the drugs were made in substandard conditions and have been barred from entry into the U.S. Dollar Tree says it's cooperating with the FDA. Larry Kofsky, Bloomberg Radio.
The Bloomberg Business of Sports podcast.
How did the Yankees become this mega valuable team?
Where the money is flowing inside sports around the globe.
From the marketing perspective, where are the dollars spent?
From union heads to team owners, Scott Soshnick and Michael Barr speak to the names that power this multi-billion-dollar industry.
Boston Red Sox CEO Sam Kennedy.
National Hockey League Commissioner Gary Bettman.
Bloomberg Business of Sports. Listen today on Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts.
IBKR is the professional's gateway to the world's markets. The IBKR Lite account plan offers investors $0 commissions on U.S.-listed stocks and ETFs, no inactivity fees, and streamlined mobile and web trading tools. In addition, IBKR Lite offers low-cost access to stocks, options, futures, forex, fixed income, and more on over 125 markets in 31 countries. Learn more or open an IBKR Lite account at ibkr.com/lite.
'Tis the season to be hunched over your laptop. Not on our watch. In real life, you can feel your senses and your baskets. Feel all the sights, sounds, lols, and OMGs. Wear laughing emojis on actual smiley faces. Battery's running low. Take the kids to Santa's Grotto. In real life, you can find just the right present using the most advanced search engine in the world. Your eyes. We hunt in real life. Brent Cross, London. Free parking for all sleighs and cars.
If you're planning on driving this weekend, expect delays on the A406 North Circular Road. There'll be road closures between Edmonton and Tottenham from 10 p.m. on Friday the 15th of November to 5 a.m. on Monday the 18th of November, while we carry out essential maintenance and repairs. All roads in the surrounding area will be extremely busy, so please allow more time for your journey and expect delays in the area. Plan ahead and check alternative routes at tfl.gov.uk. To the Mayor of London and TfL, every journey matters.
Hacksaw, jigsaw or mitre saw? I'm just not sure.
Sharpening up for a big project? Head to the B&Q Tool Shop. Get hands-on in-store with our wide range of saws and grinders, including the Black & Decker Scorpion-powered handsaw for just £40. The B&Q Tool Shop. You can do it when you B&Q it.
Introducing a new podcast, ESPN Daily. When you want to go beyond your feed, when you want to get inside the score, when you want to get behind the highlight, there's ESPN Daily. Go deeper into the stories of the moment. Get the exclusive access and insider perspective that only ESPN can give you. ESPN Daily, hosted by me, Mina Kimes. Listen and favorite ESPN Daily on TuneIn.
Ah, finally another commercial, said no one ever. Visit tunein.com/premium to upgrade now and get over 45 commercial-free music stations.
At home or on the go, stay up to date on the latest news and political trends with Fox's full lineup of shows. Plus, when news breaks, Fox has you covered with live updates and expert analysis on the biggest developing stories. Listen to Fox News Talk anytime on TuneIn.
The puck drops. 12 players face off to win. The suspense is pure torture, but you wouldn't miss this for the world. TuneIn brings you every minute of the NHL season. Listen live to hockey when it matters most on TuneIn.
Hey, can't watch the big NBA game because your life's just too busy? I've got some news for you. TuneIn Premium is the answer to all your problems. Hear every home and away game live or on demand everywhere you go. Just search NBA to listen.
Broadcasting live to London on DAB digital radio, to New York, Bloomberg 1130, to Washington DC, Bloomberg 99.1, to Boston, Bloomberg 106.1, to San Francisco, Bloomberg 960, and around the globe, the Bloomberg Business app and BloombergRadio.com. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.
8:30 a.m. in London, 9:30 if you're listening in Paris, Frankfurt or Brussels. Good morning, everyone. I'm Naira Chehich.
And I'm Roger Hearing, and you're listening to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.
And on this Friday, 30 minutes into the equity market open here in Europe, we're in the green after 2 days of declines for the Stock 600, up 0.4% today. Across regional equity benchmarks, the FTSE 100 up 0.4%, the CAC 40 higher by 0.6%, DAX trades 0.3% in the green, and the IBEX and FTSE MIB also trading higher. This after comments from Larry Kudlow on the short strokes of a US-China agreement, bringing a little bit of risk on into the markets today. We closed flat on the S&P 500 yesterday with a bit of a positive bias, and futures certainly pointing to a positive bias at the open. S&P 500 E-minis up 0.2%, NASDAQ and Dow futures higher by at least 0.25 percentage point. Could we see a sixth week of gains for global equities? At the moment, we're edging into the red, but perhaps the European and the US session later could turn turn that around. A little bit of a turnaround in the bond markets as well after we saw the 10-year yield head towards 180 yesterday, dropping several basis points. Trifecta of data from Japan, China and Germany causing concern the global economy could be skating on thin ice. The 10-year Treasury yield was edging up a few basis points earlier. It's actually steady now on a 183 handle. The 10-year Bund yield also goes nowhere, negative 34, and the 10-year gilt yield edging up a basis point. In terms of the risk picture, we've seen the yen retreat for the first time in 6 sessions. Right now, dollar yen up 0.1%, 108.53. Little bit of weakness in gold as well, as we have seen some yuan strength, all this being fueled by the latest in the US-China trade headlines, and oil on the front foot as well. WTI, actually, it's given up its gains now. WTI flat at 56.80, Brent crude at 62.22, oil heading for a weekly loss. We saw some weakness yesterday on the stockpile data, Roger, but we also have more data, this time from Hong Kong.
Yeah, within the last few moments, Hong Kong has cut the 2019 GDP forecast to negative 1.3% from 0 to 1%. That's been breaking through. This is a final reading of the GDP, a revision from the previous thought, and they're expecting their first annual recession since 2009.
Let's get to our top stories then and come back to trade. So the offshore yuan jumping, as I was saying, Roger, on renewed trade truce optimism after White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow said a deal is coming down to the short strokes, a golfing term. Bloomberg's Selena Wang has the latest from Beijing.
Positive comments coming from White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow. He said that negotiations over the first phase of a trade agreement with China were coming down to the final stages, with the two sides in close contact. The two sides have held working-level video conferences in recent days focused on issues ranging from the details and timeline of Chinese purchases of U.S. agricultural goods such as pork and soybeans to commitments to curtail theft of intellectual property that Trump is demanding from China. Separately, Kudlow said the president has not yet made a decision on whether to impose or delay, as many expect, new auto tariffs on imported cars and parts from the European Union. In Beijing, I'm Selena Wang, Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.
And billionaire hedge fund manager Ray Dalio is warning that the conflict between the US and China could expand beyond trade and technology. The Bridgewater Associates founder says a capital war could be next. Congress has been trying to limit the amount of money that flows from US pension and investment funds into China.
Alibaba says shares will be offered to retail investors at 188 Hong Kong dollars each. 188 would be a better way to express that. It's also picked auspicious numbers for its stock code ahead of its secondary listing in the city. The South China Morning Post says there's been an enormous response to the listing, which could raise up to $15 billion. Alibaba's stock code will be 9988, which rhymes with prosperity forever.
Oh, that's nice. And money managers are out with their latest holdings and moves from the third quarter. 13F filings hit last night, revealing the latest trends amongst hedge funds. After a dramatic 3 months for markets, we'll hear with the details of what was bought, what was sold. Bloomberg's Danny Berger. So, Danny, Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway always closely watched for their holding changes. What did we learn about their third quarter moves?
So, one of the more remarkable things is looking at Apple's holdings. So Apple, it's been one of their largest holdings. This was a change in the first quarter after some of his deputies said, okay, you need to get into tech. You haven't really, you're missing out. So they added to Apple a lot. However, this past quarter, we saw him start to trim. It wasn't by a lot, but trimming nonetheless. Also cut some of his other top holdings, including Phillips 66, Wells Fargo as well. Wells Fargo has a bit to do with the threshold. They're only allowed to hold 10% or less of the firm, so they had to cut to meet that. But basically just getting a bit closer to the ground. And this really is indicative of what hedge funds did in the third quarter, a more defensive posture amid all the macro uncertainty. One other thing to note in terms of Buffett's holdings, he added to RH. It's a home company, and we saw those shares rise 8% after market. So it really shows just how much influence he has. When Buffett buys, it looks like quite a few others out there follow suit.
Yeah, and Danny, it was a difficult quarter as well for tech stocks. How did hedge funds treat those shares?
So they didn't quite get these bets right if we're judging by performance in the third quarter. So Facebook, it was a favorite. We saw Chase Coleman, David Tepper, both of their hedge funds increased their holdings of Facebook. Even Harvard, the endowment there increased their holding about $400 million now worth of Facebook. But Facebook tumbled 8%. Netflix, another hedge fund darling, Maverick Capital, D1 Capital Partners, all went into Netflix as well. That did even worse than Facebook, dropping 27% in the third quarter. But hedge funds, they love tech. They love these momentum names. And it's not clear that buying is going to let up, considering they added, even though those shares tumbled. Maybe it's just a buying opportunity for them.
So we know what they love. What do they hate? What sectors did they turn sour on?
Yeah, so as I said, those Netflix and Facebook bet might not have been the most prudent in the third quarter. But one thing they started to sell that we saw, especially a lot of the Tiger Cubs, sold Microsoft. We also saw Drunken Miller's family fund sell Microsoft as well. But Microsoft did really, really well last quarter compared to the other tech giants. It rallied more than 3%. It's been a top performer this year almost gaining 46%. So perhaps this is a little bit of selling the winners, buying the losers, looking for those valuation plays, what looks attractive. Perhaps that's why it is. But Microsoft, again, did well, but we saw a lot of selling.
Danny, when you were saying that hedge funds turned more defensive in the third quarter, I started thinking about the latest Bank of America Merrill Lynch survey, which clearly showed fear of missing out, investors moving off the sidelines, moving to equities, cash holdings dropping to the lowest since 2013. We know that 13Fs are backward looking because they reflect third quarter holdings. What do we know about how positions have shifted since they filed? Do they in any way reflect what that Bank of America Merrill Lynch survey showed?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and this is something some analysts have pointed to, saying, look, the S&P has further to go because hedge funds had been close to the ground. As you say, fear of missing out, getting back in. So certainly that evidence we saw from the fund manager survey points to that. Prime brokerage data from Morgan Stanley also shows that hedge funds, they've started to make bets on their long positions. So they start to boost their long positions relative to the shorts at the fastest pace in over a year. So really showing that the troughs of pessimism, perhaps it's just that it's a trough. We're starting to see a rebound. And we are likely also to see perhaps some investors getting into value names as well, because that's something that is done pretty well, even though it suffered at the beginning of this year. So as for now, it seems like they are going on to that FOMO trade. How long it lasts, that is a question that cannot be answered at this moment because it is just such an uncertain environment.
It certainly is. Danny, thanks very much. Danny Berger there with details of what was in the 13F filings. Let's get the latest now in global news. Here's Bloomberg's Leanne Gerrans. Leanne, good morning.
Roger, good morning. Let's start with one of our top stories. China's President Xi Jinping says the most pressing task for Hong Kong is to end violence and restore order. Xi's comments were reported by state broadcaster CCTV as the city faces a fifth consecutive weekday of disruption and a second protest-related death in a week. The rare intervention came as the U.S. Senate moved to expedite legislation that would support Hong Kong's pro-democracy protesters. Now to Hungary. A month after losing Budapest in a stinging election defeat, Prime Minister Viktor Orban's government has unveiled a proposal to restrict the new mayor's powers over the capital's budget. Bloomberg's Zoltán Simán reports.
The cabinet wants Budapest to use business tax receipts, the city's biggest source of income, primarily for funding the unprofitable public transportation system, a move that threatens to suck away resources from other areas, including social services. The deputy mayor said it could allow Orbán to financially squeeze the opposition-controlled capital. In Budapest, Zoltán Simán, Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.
And on the UK campaign trail today, Labour is promising to give every home and business in the UK free, full fibre broadband by 2030 if it wins a general election. Meanwhile, the Conservatives are pledging more cash to boost high streets and overlooked towns. Yesterday, the DUP Sammy Wilson told Bloomberg Westminster why he's hoping for a hung parliament.
I'm not so sure that this general election is going to give him the conclusive outcome that he was hoping to obtain. He's got lots of challenges in Scotland. There are 13 seats under threat. The Brexit Party has made it quite clear that although they've stood aside in Conservative seats, they will still challenge in Labour seats, and so they should. And the Liberal Democrats, of course, will be eating away at the Conservative vote. So, I'm not going to predict what the outcome of the election will be. And if there's another hung parliament, we have made it quite clear we will not be giving support to the Prime Minister's deal. We're going to have to get it changed.
Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg.
Right now, Doctors Without Borders medical teams are operating in some of the most remote and dangerous corners of the world. When front yards become front lines, at the crossroads of conflict and epidemic, where there are no hospitals. That's where we operate. Your response is critical to our response in places where few others will go. That's where we operate. Learn more at doctorswithoutborders.org.
Are you looking for senior care for your mom or dad but don't know where to start? Hi, I'm Joan London with The Place for Mom. Nobody knows your parent or loved one better than you, and nobody knows senior living better than the experts at A Place for Mom. It's a free service, and we've helped thousands of families find the right place for their mom or dad. There's a place for answers, A Place for Mom. Call today.
Call A Place for Mom at 1-800-391-1755. That's 1-800-391-1755.
Imagine being denied an apartment because of your religion, or your race, or because you have children, or a disability.
It's so wrong.
Yes, but who has the power to stop this?
You do. Each of us has the power. The law is on your side. It's illegal for landlords to discriminate because of race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, or familial status. If you suspect that you have experienced housing discrimination, file a complaint with HUD immediately so we can investigate it. Fair housing is your right.
Use it.
To learn more, visit HUD.gov/fairhousing. That's HUD.gov/fairhousing. Or call 1-800-669-9777. 1-800-669-9777. A public service message from HUD in partnership with the National Fair Housing Alliance.
Just because you travel doesn't mean you can't keep your routine. The more obstacles travel puts between us and our well-being, the more we strive to sleep well. At Westin Hotels and Resorts, we're focused on empowering your well-being. With our Sleep Well menu and lavender balm, you can refuel your body and mind and meet the challenges of the day head-on. Don't leave your well-being behind. We give you the choice to get up or to rise. Search Westin online to find out more. Westin, let's rise.
Whatever job you're searching for, you can find it on LinkedIn. First jobs, flexible jobs, work from home on a Friday jobs, advertising jobs, accounting jobs, HR, PR, even ER jobs, Soho jobs, Shoreditch jobs. Keep me away from the central line jobs. Banking jobs, building jobs, never ever boring jobs. Small jobs, big jobs, lunch in Borough Market jobs, or even voiceover jobs, which is how I ended up recording this ad. Search millions of jobs on LinkedIn and find one meant for you.
'Tis the season to be hunched over your laptop. Not on our watch. In real life, you can fill your senses and your baskets. Feel all the sights, sounds, lols, and OMGs. Wear laughing emojis on actual smiley faces. Battery's running low. Take the kids to Santa's Grotto. In real life, you can find just the right present using the most advanced search engine in the world. Your eyes. We hunt in real life. Brent Cross, London. Free parking for all sleighs and cars.
Next. Nah. Nope. Boring. If you skip through loads of your TV channels, why are you paying loads of money for them? With TalkTalk TV and Faster Fibre, you can access the nation's favourite TV shows, a world of films and sport, live and on demand, all for £25.95 a month for 18 months. And if you're quick, you'll even get a year of Amazon Prime on us. Search TalkTalk TV. TalkTalk. For everyone. Offer ends 5th of December, subject to availability. T's and C's apply.
When it comes to music, I've heard it all. Pink Floyd, Sean Paul, Slipknot. But in the Witch Test Lab, hearing isn't enough. When we test headphones, we really listen. Not just to the music, but to the stuff that gets in the way. The traffic, the chatter, all that. Mind the gap. We simulate the loudest commute to find you the headphones that cancel out the noise. So you know we're only recommending the best.
Which tests harder so you can buy smarter. Visit which.co.uk.
If you're planning on driving this weekend, expect delays on the A406 North Circular Road. There'll be road closures between Edmonton and Tottenham from 10 p.m. on Friday the 15th of November to 5 a.m. on Monday the 18th of November, while we carry out essential maintenance and repairs. All roads in the surrounding area will be extremely busy, so please allow more time for your journey and expect delays in the area. Plan ahead and check alternative routes at tfl.gov.uk. To the Mayor of London and TfL, every journey matters.
Ladies and gentlemen, behold the world's most fantastical, sensational number. 98 million. Tonight's Euro Millions jackpot is a massive £98 million.
Euro Millions, celebrating 25 years of the National Lottery. Your numbers make amazing happen. Estimated jackpot. Rules and procedures apply. Players must be 16 or over.
With the new Halifax Family Boost mortgage, children can get help to buy their first home, and mum and dad earn interest on their savings. Everyone's a winner. The new Halifax Family Boost mortgage. Halifax makes it happen.
Your home and savings could be at risk if mortgage repayments are not maintained. Only available in England and Wales. One applicant must hold a Halifax Reward or Ultimate Reward current account. Conditions and exclusions apply.
Markets, headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app and at TikTok on Twitter. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg's European headquarters in London, I'm Sandra Kilhoff with this Bloomberg Radio Business Flash. Now, it's very much a risk-on day in Europe. Today, we're seeing the Stock 600 currently up 0.3%, the FTSE gaining 0.2%. Similarly so for the DAX. The CAC 40 gaining 0.5% in Paris. It follows a similar risk-on day in Asia, with U.S. equity futures also pointing higher. It's all because White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow has suggested progress on a trade deal. Now, in stocks, I'm keeping a close eye on Maersk today, the world's biggest shipping company, cutting its outlook for container growth. But EBITDA did beat. That's amounted to a fairly flat trading session for the stock in Copenhagen at the moment. Now, the positive trade sentiment is boosting China's yuan and the Kiwi and Aussie dollars. We're seeing the offshore yuan gaining 0.2%, trading above 7 at the moment. The Korean won also gaining 0.2% today. The yen, meanwhile, selling off slightly, down 0.1% at 108.5. The Bloomberg dollar spot index unchanged. If we turn to Europe, the pound is holding at 1.288. The Norwegian krona, however, very much outperforming today, beating all G10 currencies, up 0.1%. If we take a look at bonds, 10-year Treasury yields ticking higher, up a basis point at 1.83%. It did slide as much as 7 basis points yesterday. 10-year Bund yields currently up a basis point at negative 34. 10-year gilt yields also gaining to 72 basis points. Finally, oil gaining, WTI currently up 0.1% at $56 a barrel. Gold, meanwhile, lower, sliding 0.3% to $1,467 a troy ounce. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now here's Leanne Garrins with more on what's going on around the world. Sandra, thank you. 2 students have been killed and 3 others injured by a gunman who opened fire at a secondary school in California, officials say. The shooting took place at Saugus High School in Santa Clarita minutes before the school day was actually due to begin. A 16-year-old suspect who was also injured has now been taken into custody. A state of emergency has been declared in Venice as a historic city deals with the worst flooding in more than 50 years. There's anger from locals that a huge underwater defense barrier still hasn't been finished. Italy's Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte has chaired a special cabinet meeting after visiting the city. And finally, Taylor Swift is accusing her former record label of stopping her performing her old songs. This escalating a dispute with powerful celebrity manager, that's Scooter Braun. The singer-songwriter tweeted a plea asking fans and asset management firm Carlyle Group to help her secure ownership of 6 albums she recorded under the Big Machine label. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Garrins. This is Bloomberg Naira.
Leanne, this is quite a long-running and complicated story, actually, a lot of which has been played out on social media.
It is a long-running story. You're absolutely right. So Taylor Swift is now wanting her music back because obviously she was signed to an old record label who bought the 6 albums. And what she's saying is that now in an upcoming documentary and in new stage performances, she can't perform her hits that made, like, everyone, we all know, Shake It Off. We are never going to get back together again.
Okay. What about Trouble?
Yeah, Trouble will be one of them, because a new album, Lover, has been recorded under another record label, which is very, current at the moment, and she can obviously play. So let's see what happens. But this does happen, and these disputes do seem to go on a long time. You're correct, indeed.
All right. Leanne Garrins.
Yeah, talking about old disputes and old songs.
Yes.
And new hits. Let's move on to the China-US trade dispute, which is, I have to say, this week it's been up, it's been down, it's been up, it's been down. The latest thing is Larry Kudlow saying that negotiations in at least a phase 1 trade deal are coming to their final stages. That certainly is a line we've heard before. Let's bring in John Levito, Global Fixed Income Co-CIO at American Century. John, welcome. Good morning. Thanks for being with us. What's your reading of where this is going at the moment? Are you an optimist at this stage?
Well, as you said, it's been a week of up and down, but to be frank, it's really been a year of up and down when we talk about the China trade situation. And to be frank, we think that's going to continue. Now, in the short term, this is an optimistic development. It looks like, from both the China side and the U.S. side, détente really is in both of their favor, right? Coming up on U.S. elections, China growth slowing. So I think some sort of short-term détente, phase one to be enacted, is going to happen. But it doesn't change the longer-term trajectory, which is really a multi-year battle between two superpowers, economically and militarily, that are vying for really, global control. So this is going to continue, and it is something that will, probably quiet down at some point for a little bit, but it'll be back in the headlines from time to time over the course of the months and years ahead.
So how do you approach this in a fixed income strategy from a tactical, active perspective versus strategic?
Yeah. So for us, we're very much relative value investors, and so, we obviously have our views of what's going to happen, what's next in the market and the economy. But to us, what really drives our decision is relative value, and we really, over the last month or two, have been tactically bringing down our risk, actually, because we see this as I mentioned, really more of a short-term positive with regard to the détente. But valuations in fixed income around credit, whether it's investment grade, high yield, securitized, are quite expensive right now. So what we're waiting for really is to sort of lay in the weeds a little bit, wait for a little bit more volatility, some spreads to widen out a little bit, and we'll be back in the market.
So you are expecting volatility?
Yeah, volatility can come from a number of sources. Obviously, this is in the short term good news for risk. We see it, a lot of it being priced in. But volatility as we turn the calendar when it comes to the U.S. election cycle is going to continue. It's going to bring news day in and day out with regard to sort of different developments and what could happen from a financial perspective going forward. So yeah, I think volatility is going to continue. It may not be volatility that we saw like last year in Q4. What's different now, obviously, central banks are much more accommodative. Last year we were worried about the Federal Reserve going too far. But that said, given where valuations right now, given that we think we'll see spikes in volatility, we think that we can sort of play it a little bit easy right now.
How does the Fed react to all this? Do you believe that they'll be on pause for 2020 with maybe a cut in September, which is what the market is fully pricing in right now?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment. I don't think we would disagree what the market's pricing in. We see that, you can hear the optimism coming out of the Fed with regard to steady U.S. growth. Inflation certainly not an issue. And I think right now they feel that they've reacted well with regard to sort of bringing rates back down to sort of counter what happened over the last year with regard to trade. And I think they're fairly optimistic that we have, maybe not excessive growth, but steady growth in the U.S. with low inflation, and they'll play it by ear and potentially one more next year.
No room for the negative rates that were being urged on Jerome Powell. I mean, that's just totally not in the ballpark even several years going forward.
We don't think so. I think obviously there's different motivations in terms of calling for negative rates, but with regard to where growth is at 2%, 2.5%, inflation still steady around 1.5%, 2%. I think negative rates are probably, if they come, a bit in the distance when we see a downturn in the U.S. and broader global economy.
You were saying that you'd been kind of bringing down your risk exposure in terms of credit. I'm wondering then if you expect maybe one rate cut in 2020, how you would trade the Treasury curve. Would you put steepeners on here? And do you expect that steepening to be led by a drop in yields at the front end, or actually a little bit more of a backup at the back end? Just talk us through your thinking on the curve.
I'm glad you brought that up because it's actually a position we have on currently. We are positioned and have been positioned for a steeper yield curve. So if you look at our portfolios right now, we are for the most part centered around the front end 2-3 year part of the Treasury yield curve, and we're short in the intermediate and long term. And I really think it's a modest yield curve steepening, and I think it's more so driven by the long end coming off here a little bit. And that is because I think the market's going to come around to the fact that unlike a few months ago when they were concerned that the Fed was behind the curve, that they were concerned the Fed was not reacting enough, I think data the trade situation is probably giving a little more optimism that maybe the Fed had it right. They're not behind the curve, which will allow for rates to rise, modestly. We're not talking about a serious sell-off, but a slight steepener here. And so for us, again, as a value investor, that makes sense to have a steepener.
Well, yeah, you're talking about the data, and there is a lot of optimism, as you say, but a lot of people keep an eye on the retail sales out today. What are you expecting from that? What will it tell us about the US consumer, which is what everyone goes on, particularly this time of year?
Well, this time of year, as we go into the holiday season, the consumer will be very important. But if you really look, if you look at the last GDP data, really, 2/3 of the growth really came from the consumer. The consumer has been holding up well. It'll be interesting to see what comes out with retail sales, but I think generally the consumer's in pretty good shape. We have full employment. We have fairly good optimism. So I think generally the consumer is fine, and I think that'll hold up during the holiday season.
When you talk about relative value as well, are you making any trades in terms of relative value globally, the US versus other markets, Europe or emerging markets, for example?
Yeah. So, as I said, we're low on risk right now. So our positioning has been more recently, we have been long U.S. Treasuries and short Europe, although we've been bringing that back down as over the last number of months, as we know, U.S. has outperformed Europe with the rally over the last 2-3 months. And so we've benefited from that. So we're really neutralizing those positions. We do have some positions in emerging markets as well, but they're more yield curve positions as well. So, for instance, one position that we have on is Mexico. Mexico flat to actually inverted yield curve to support the Mexican peso. We've had a steepener in there. It's worked very well for us. The curve has steepened 35 basis points over the last 2 months. And we're slightly long Mexico as well, but that's really our major emerging market position right now.
All right, John, thank you very much. John Levito there, Global Fixed Income Co-CIO at American Century, joining us there in the studio. And coming up, Anna Edwards and Caroline Hepker will be back on Daybreak Europe, speaking to Nick Watson, Fund Manager at Janus Henderson Global Investors.
And we are almost an hour into the equity market open here in Europe, and we are seeing a little bit of a risk-on day, green on the screen for European equities and US futures, with a little bit of optimism coming in on Larry Kudlow's comments on US-China trade talks. This is Bloomberg.
'Tis the season to be hunched over your laptop. Not on our watch. In real life, you can feel your senses and your baskets. Feel all the sights, sounds, lols, and OMGs. Wear laughing emojis on actual smiley faces. Battery is running low. Take the kids to Santa's Grotto. In real life, you can find just the right present using the most advanced search engine in the world. Your eyes. We heart in real life. Brent Cross, London. Free parking for all sleighs and cars.
When it comes to music, I've heard it all. Pink Floyd, Sean Paul, Slipknot. But in the Witch Test Lab, hearing isn't enough. When we test headphones, we really listen. Not just to the music, but to the stuff that gets in the way. The traffic, the chatter, all that. Mind the gap. We simulate the loudest commute to find you the headphones that cancel out the noise. So you know we're only recommending the best.
Which tests harder so you can buy smarter. Visit which.co.uk.
If you're planning on driving this weekend, expect delays on the A406 North Circular Road. There'll be road closures between Edmonton and Tottenham from 10 p.m. on Friday the 15th of November to 5 a.m. on Monday the 18th of November, while we carry out essential maintenance and repairs. All roads in the surrounding area will be extremely busy, so please allow more time for your journey and expect delays in the area. Plan ahead and check alternative routes at tfl.gov.uk. To the Mayor of London and TfL, every journey matters.
World 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on the Bloomberg Business app, and at TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg Radio.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.
External pressure is going to be an opportunity for reform in China. I think liquidity more generally across financial markets is an issue and a concern.
The Spanish banks in particular are in a much better place than they were 5 years ago.
It wouldn't be great to have a drawn-out trade conflict with the US or indeed with anybody else.
But I've never been one to prophesy where sterling will be, and you're a madman if you think you can.
Bloomberg Daybreak Europe on Bloomberg Radio.
Good morning from London. I'm Anna Edwards.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. Warm welcome to the programme this morning. Lots to think about in the markets. Hong Kong, the government now forecasting the first annual contraction since the global financial crisis a decade ago. And then the big pledge today in the elections here in Britain. Labour talking about nationalising BT's Openreach. So this trying to make the big pledge to voters offering free full fibre broadband. Big reaction in the markets.
Yeah, big reaction in the markets to both to that story. Big questions earlier on in the week around global growth, to which that Hong Kong line plays in. Caroline, of course, we've been monitoring the violent situation on the streets there for many, many months now. I'll add into the mix, just breaking across the Bloomberg now, some headlines from the IEA, the International Energy Agency, saying that they see calm global oil markets in 2020 as new supplies soar. Calm sounds like a good word for a Friday morning, so we'll take that. That's the picture on oil just now. Then we've got oil prices fairly flat actually right now, 56.78 on WTI. Brent is at 62.18, a touch weaker on the Brent price versus yesterday's close. Let's get to the equity markets though. We check the data for you every 15 minutes here on Bloomberg Radio. The Stock 600 is up by 0.3%. The FTSE 100 up 0.2%. The better gains coming on the CAC 40 up 0.6%, and the Xetra DAX up around 0.25%. US futures also point higher by 0.25%, 0.3%, that kind of metric. So we do see this broad optimism really around risk assets this morning in Europe and probably into the US session ahead as well. Larry Kudlow saying that we're down to the short strokes in the final stages, to use this golf or is it art metaphor. So that's where he suggests we are on the trade conversation. That's giving optimism to the markets. As a result of that, we see yields going higher as well, a little bit of money coming out of treasuries. So we're at 1.83% in the yield on the US 10-year. The dollar is fairly flat. The yen retreats a touch. We're at 108.56. No great movement in the pound. In cable, 128.74 is where we trade on cable as we get ever closer, of course, to that December 12th election.
Yeah, indeed. I'm reliably informed that coming down to the short strokes is actually the really hard bit of playing golf, chipping and putting.
I have no golfing insight, but apparently it's also an art metaphor. I think, though, that Larry Kudlow is probably more golf.
Yes, I suspect
I'm guessing.
So. But anyway, let's talk about that. Larry Kudlow talking about China and the US getting close to signing the phase one of a trade deal. The White House economic advisor saying that negotiations are coming down to the last stages. So what does it all mean for markets? Well, let's bring in Nick Watson, who is fund manager at Janus Henderson Global Investors. Very good to have you on Bloomberg Radio this morning, as well as television. Look, the markets have been trading every news line, and yet again, we're getting closer, but nothing's been signed.
I think that's exactly right. The market is trading off the back of the rumours that you start to hear. It may well be one of the cases where you want to be buying the rumour and actually selling the fact in a lot of these discussions. Donald Trump was pretty constructive in his most recent comments. As you mentioned, Kudlow overnight has also been there. The actual detail remains to be seen, and as ever, you don't just want to hear the American side of the story, you want to hear the Chinese moving in the same direction to have real traction, to be constructive.
I suppose if you're thinking about what reaction we see in risk assets to a phase one deal, and good morning to you, Nick, once again, I spoke to you earlier on TV. If we're thinking about what kind of market reaction we might see here, I suppose we need to see the detail of what the phase one includes, but I suppose the danger is, as you say, that a lot of this is priced in. If what we end up with is a situation where China is buying as much agricultural product as they did before the most recent tensions, if that's all that's moving, then that's not going to be enough to sustain a rally from here for very long.
I think that's right. I think the observation there is about the sustainable nature of the rally. Seasonally going into Q4 is traditionally a time to be long risk assets. And also if you think about what's responding positively towards these trade news flows, it's generally the more cyclical part of the market where frankly not many people are invested. So you don't necessarily need to have for the market to move quite quickly, you don't need to have the detail, but for it to be sustainable and for the outperformance to be prolonged, you do want to have some detail, some conviction that both sides really are making strides in the right direction.
And yet it does seem that recession fears have retreated somewhat. Are we past peak worry? I note Jerome Powell's second day of testimony yesterday talking about the US economy as a star performer, that he's confident about the record of expansion and that the US will stay on track.
Yeah, it was interesting hearing those comments, as we said on TV this morning. There seems to be a very clear narrative which the Fed has lined up in terms of the economy's in a good place, rates are exactly where they should be. I think if you think about the long-term trajectory we've had for economic growth, we've had a very stable, frankly, dull period of economic expansion. And within that, you have had...
There's a lot to be said for dull.
There's a lot to be said for dull, and as you said about calm earlier on your comments, there's been this prolonged economic expansion. It's been quite muted, it's been quite dull. But I think actually from a sort of central bank perspective, it's been what they would have been looking for. And even within that, you've had these mini economic cycles. And you can argue with the Fed having made their pivot, then their 3 interest rate cuts over the past year or so. We're now on a mini expansion. You're having potentially a pickup in some economic data. So you're going to have these bumps in the road, but the trajectory is still pretty constructive.
So on the US then, how much exposure do you want to have to US assets at this point if we've got the Fed on pause, if we are seeing the US economy in a good place, as the Fed likes to tell us?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to where do you see the attractive valuations at the moment. In an environment when you have constructive economic activity, not spectacular, but nonetheless it is there. You have inflation at around 2%, so central banks aren't under pressure to be raising rates. That's broadly an environment when you probably do want to be owning risk assets. Your question then comes down to where do you want to be exposed. If the US is very popular, it's quite a crowded trade to my mind, and valuations on a historical basis do look more expensive than other parts of the market. On the flip side, you have to take a bit more risk if you go into emerging markets or Europe where the valuations are maybe more compelling. So you have to balance that risk-return trade-off.
What's your view then when it comes to Europe? Germany obviously avoided a technical recession this week, but then the finance minister saying that basically takes any stimulus package off the table, yet Germany we still have an industrial downturn.
Yeah, I mean, Germany's interesting. I mean, they had 10 basis points of economic growth over the past quarter.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the sort of thing at which stage economists are that's a sense of humour for them.
Yeah.
I don't think it's really going to materially move the dial. The Germans have also not been particularly pro-stimulus. I mean, Christine Lagarde was quite clear in one of her first press conferences that monetary policy is not going to be able to move economies out of the next downturn. You do need fiscal, and she directly pointed at places like the Netherlands and Germany to be the countries who have room to do that.
But does it take a crisis for that to happen now, or will Christine Lagarde be able to do that heavy lifting?
I think that's a fair point. I mean, it's interesting that Christine Lagarde is a politician rather than actually an economist in terms of trading, so it may well be the case she needs to use all her political power to drag the ECB kicking and screaming in that direction. And the ECB historically has not been the quickest moving of central banks. It does take a little while for them to gain some traction in a certain direction.
One of our colleagues writing a story suggesting that German stimulus craved by the ECB probably hinges on job losses, and you do get that sense that a lot of things in Europe are forged in crisis, aren't they? To your point, Caroline, and maybe it's a sort of job unemployment crisis that would be needed to really make the fiscal package work. Talking of fiscal spending, plenty of fiscal spending being promised in the UK, regardless of who is elected. Is this an investment theme? Because I know that one of your themes that you're thinking about at the moment is alternative assets around infrastructure, social housing, and the like. I mean, that must be pretty investable in the UK, is it?
I think it is interesting. It does bring with it its own specific risks. I mean, the observation we've had about BT this morning, there are certain parts of the UK market where infrastructure spending, or let's say Labour government, might not necessarily be constructive. I think the point about fiscal spending is interesting because it's a completely different market dynamic to what we've had over the past decade. Over the past decade, you've had QE, crushing rates, crushing inflation, crushing volatility. If you move in a fiscal direction, that is essentially, frankly, the opposite. That's much more inflationary. It's a completely different dynamic in terms of what's worked from an equity market perspective.
Okay, but obviously, I mean, the markets are concerned, are they not, about the volatility of the election period, the uncertainty around the outcome, and then what that means for Brexit. It does look, at least in the polls at the moment, as if the Tory party still have something of a lead, but there does seem to be a growing concern around potentially a Jeremy Corbyn-led government and what that would mean for the City of London and for investing in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite hard to divorce yourself from the sort of City of London bubble, if you like, when you're sat in the city and you do hear a lot of what Labour might be doing. I think you have to look at what the polls are telling you and what the betting markets are telling you. And the likelihood of a Labour majority is very small at the moment. Now, it may well be that builds into the election, but at the moment you're looking at a 50% chance of a Tory majority, 50% chance of a hung parliament. A Tory outcome would probably be constructive for UK assets. That's quite constructive for business. You might get some degree of certainty that Brexit will be done. So off the back of that, you might see some pop in sterling assets, certainly in sterling. I'm not sure that's necessarily sustainable because that does bring forward a slightly more hard Brexit than you would get if you, let's say, had a Labour Party win.
Okay, yeah, I saw some analysis from RBC saying the pound looks overbought based on that polling lead that the Conservatives have at the moment, but according to RBC, could move. Nick, thank you to you for your thoughts. Nick Watson, Fund Manager at Janus Henderson Global Investors, joining us here on TV and radio.
Well, speaking of that UK election, we've got more on that in global news. Here's Bloomberg's Leanne Gerrans. Good morning.
Good morning, Caroline. Let's start here in the UK, as you mentioned. Boris Johnson is making a pitch for voters in overlooked towns. He is promising to revive high streets through tax breaks for local businesses and reopen provincial railway lines. Bloomberg's Alex Morales says Johnson was somewhat eclipsed by Corbyn's broadband promise.
The UK Prime Minister on Friday announced cuts to business rates for shops, pubs and cinemas and promised £500 million to help restore local rail networks that were cut in the 1960s. But his largesse was eclipsed by Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, who on Friday is set to outline plans to roll out free full-fibre broadband across the country, with a plan that includes nationalisation of BT's Openreach unit. In London, Alex Morales, Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.
Istanbul's new mayor says his election victory against Turkish President Erdogan's party carries a lesson for the world's populist leaders. Act against the will of the people you claim to represent, and you will lose it all, as the joint candidate of Turkey's opposition led by the Republican People's Party CHP, Ekrem İmamoğlu, beat Erdogan's candidate in March. He spoke to Bloomberg about his future ambitions.
There are years ahead of us. My only focus is to work very hard. If you work very hard without you making any plans, people already send you to where they think you fit. Right now, my only focus is to become very successful as a mayor of Istanbul.
China's President Xi Jinping says the most pressing task for Hong Kong is to end violence and restore order. Xi's comments were reported by state broadcaster CCTV as the city faces a fifth consecutive weekday of disruption and a second protest-led death in a week. The rare intervention came as the US Senate approved to expedite legislation that would support Hong Kong's pro-democracy protesters. And finally, an experimental ultra-long-haul flight from London to Sydney has now touched down after 19 hours and 19 minutes. People on board were mostly Qantas employees fitted with loads of monitors. The data will be looked at a medical institute in Sydney to examine how long journeys actually affect our health. Global News 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg Anna.
Pity the aviation guinea pigs. Thanks very much, Leanne. Now with your morning sports news, here's George Alderman.
England thrashed Montenegro 7-0 last night to mark their 1,000th international match in style. The victory sealed their place at next summer's European Championships. Raheem Sterling came out in defence of Joe Gomez on Twitter following the game at Wembley, after his England teammate was booed when he came on as a substitute. Sterling was left out of the qualifier for clashing with Gomez at their training camp earlier this week. The Manchester City forward insists he's taken full responsibility for the incident and accepts the consequences. Roger Federer booked his place in the last four of the ATP Finals tennis by knocking out great rival Novak Djokovic last night. He claimed a straight sets victory at the O2 Arena in London, winning 6-4, 6-3. Federer will meet either Rafa Nadal or Stefanos Tsitsipas in the semi-finals. Those two play each other this afternoon, while Russia's Daniil Medvedev goes up against Alexander Zverev in the evening match.
So that's the European sports roundup. Now, still ahead on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, Bloomberg opinion columnist Chris Bryant will be joining us to tell us why your Land Rover has fallen out of fashion. We'll discuss that in a moment. But at the moment, the markets, the USOX 600 gains 0.3%, so solidly higher on this optimism around a US trade deal. Comments from Larry Kudlow, and S&P 500 futures gain 0.3%. Lots more to come. This is Bloomberg.
Rich is just a really good guy. The term good egg isn't enough to describe him. He's also certified organic and free range. Rich puts the cap back on everything. The toothpaste, the olive oil, the shampoo, everything. He lets his 10-year-old nephew beat him at virtual tennis, even though he can straight up slay his 10-year-old nephew in virtual tennis. When the toilet paper is running low, Rich replaces the roll on the actual holder, not just on the back of the toilet. Rich is texting and driving. Rich, no. What are you doing, Rich? I was just telling everyone how great you are. Texting and driving makes good people look bad. Visit StopTextStopWrecks.org. A public service announcement brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Ad Council.
Every investor should ask questions.
Is our money in the right place?
What am I really being charged?
And is it eating into my returns?
Is my advisor a fiduciary? Is he always a fiduciary?
A good place to start is with an independent registered investment advisor. As fiduciaries, they live by a simple rule: always act in the best interest of their clients. That's why Charles Schwab is proud to support more independent financial advisors and their clients than anyone else. Visit findyourindependentadvisor.com.
Tom has been a teacher for over 40 years. One day, I think one of the students had asked the question and he didn't remember the answer. And I also noticed that he was letting his class out earlier than they were supposed to let out. I was really starting to worry.
Levi and I talked about how it would change our lives, but he was there beside me.
When something feels different, it could be Alzheimer's. Now is the time to talk. Visit alz.org/ourstories to learn more. A message from the Alzheimer's Association and the Ad Council.
Influential conversations from Bloomberg Television. Here's Taylor Briggs.
A few former Uber employees have created a new startup, Virtual Kitchen. It's one of many entrants into the crowded field of companies renting kitchen space to restaurants desperate to satisfy demand from hungry homebodies. But it's particularly noteworthy that the founders came from Uber. Joining us to discuss the space, it is Ken Chong. He's the CEO of Virtual Kitchens. As we know, hugely crowded space. How do you stand out?
Thank you, Taylor. It's a pleasure to be here today. Food delivery is really popular. Consumers continue to love the convenience of it. And we talked to a lot of restaurateurs, and it turns out it's actually very challenging for restaurants who are built for dine-in first with a lot of seating. And so with Virtual Kitchen, we really are trying to make it seamless and turnkey for restaurateurs to expand delivery in a very simple way and with very little upfront costs. And of course, bring more selection and great food to more customers.
And you left Uber and Uber Eats in part because you saw the strain that the delivery apps were putting on those restaurants. How are you solving for that strain with your new Virtual Kitchen?
We build space, operations, and offer help on staffing, menu, and site selection to help them do the best delivery sort of product possible.
Hear more interviews like this one on Bloomberg Television, streaming live on Bloomberg.com and on the Bloomberg mobile app, or check your local cable listings.
Markets, headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app and at TikTok on Twitter. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg's European headquarters here in London, I'm Caroline Hepker with this Bloomberg Radio Business Flash. So European stocks climb up 0.4% on the US stock 600. Asia and US equity futures also gaining on this renewed trade deal hope. White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow saying that an agreement is coming down to the short strokes. This ahead of the US retail sales numbers that we get later. And just a few stragglers left when it comes to reporting earnings, including the shipping giant AP Moller-Maersk, which reported this morning still sees growth in terms of globalization and trade worldwide. Markets keeping an eye, though, closely on the unrest in Hong Kong remains a serious issue, liquidity tightening there. The Chinese yuan advances against the dollar. The PBOC was also intervening to add liquidity there, but perhaps not quite as much as markets had been expecting. The yen weakening against all of its major G10 peers, 108.65, so weaker 0.2% for the yen, and the British pound at 128 on cable weakens both against the US dollar and the euro. As for the bond markets, I'll give you a check there. So we end the week at 1.84% for US benchmark yields, so we gain 2 basis points, and German yields at negative 33 basis points, up by 1.5 basis points. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now here's Leanne Gerrans with more on what's going on around the world. Good morning.
Good morning, Caroline. A state of emergency has been declared in Venice as the historic city deals with the worst flooding in more than 50 years. There's anger from locals that a huge underwater defense barrier still hasn't been finished. Italy's Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte has chaired a special cabinet meeting after visiting the city. Bushfires continue to rage across much of eastern Australia and are clearly visible from space. At least 60 separate fires are burning in New South Wales, with 4 people known to have died. Residents in Queensland are being warned that weather conditions are expected to turn even hotter and drier. That's this weekend. And finally, Netflix is making changes to a Second World War documentary after a complaint from Poland. The country's prime minister says The Devil Next Door didn't make it clear that concentration camps streets in the country were run by the Nazis, not by the Poles. The streaming company says it's added text to maps which are featured in that programme. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg Opinion, informed perspectives, and expert data-driven commentary on breaking news.
It's 9:20 in the city. Time to check in with Bloomberg Opinion. We're joined by opinion columnist Chris Bryant, who's been writing about the struggles facing British car maker Jaguar Land Rover. Good morning to you, Chris. Thanks for joining us. So what's the big problem then for JLR right now?
I think fundamentally, Anna, the problem is this, that they are too small to compete with the giants of this world. They sell fewer than 600,000 cars a year. If you compare that to Volkswagen, which produces 10 million or so a year, that's putting them in a very difficult position because, as you know, all the car makers are having to invest huge amounts in coming years to electrify their fleets. We had Daimler yesterday saying that the profit margins of its Mercedes-Benz unit out to 2022 will be really quite low, about 5% or something. Huge disappointment for investors, and the reason is simple, that they have to spend a bunch of money to take combustion engines and make them electric. Now, Jaguar Land Rover has plans to do that, but it's having to do it with a relatively small budget, and therefore it's straining, and Bloomberg reported this week that Jaguar Land Rover is casting around for potential partnerships, maybe with BMW, maybe with Geely, China, in order to try and help share the burden.
Tata insisting that JLR, though, is not for sale.
No, and one can understand why, because they bought this asset about 10 years ago, and they did wonders with it. I mean, it really was generating a lot of cash. And why? Well, if you walk around the streets of New York and London recently, you'll know why. There are Range Rovers everywhere. It is a hugely popular vehicle. These SUVs are booming, and that's predominantly what JLR does. About 90% or so of their sales are SUVs, so that's put them in a good place. Unfortunately, they made some bad bets. They also invested a lot of money in saloon cars. They've also tried to push into China, but really come a crop of their sales plunging with the deterioration of the Chinese economy. And therefore, they ended up with this big loss last year. And going forward, they have a plan to electrify their cars, and they've had some early successes with that. The I-Pace, which is a relatively small SUV, won Car of the Year. So they are doing things, but I think it's going to be quite difficult for them. And the environment is getting tougher, not least with the climate debate. Because if you ask me, driving around a hulking great SUV in a city now is becoming more and more difficult. The first two are
and costly. And Chris, you mention it as a mainstay of the school drop-off, and I just anecdotally, on a personal level, my experience at the school gate is if you show up in something like that, you're possibly increasingly likely to get a lecture from some of the small people involved about the environmental implications of such a large vehicle. But where does this leave them in the battle for electric vehicles and the shift over which all of these car makers are facing?
Well, I think it does put them in the tight spot, and for the reason you say, you've got a younger generation now who are probably a bit embarrassed to be driven around in a car like that. But until now, we haven't really seen it in the sales. These vehicles are still selling like the clappers. However, I think with things like Extinction Rebellion drawing attention to this, and with the reality of the climate crisis increasingly apparent, the first two items on our news report just now, floods in Venice, Australia on fire. Driving one of these cars might be quite difficult. Now, the reason why Jaguar Land Rover would be confident and say, well, we're going to electrify these cars, and you'll be able to buy a plug-in hybrid variant of them and so forth, and that might be true, but ultimately you're still driving a 2.5-ton vehicle around the city, and there's a question mark as to whether really that's a necessary thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm always staggered, Anna, in London, given how small the roads are, just how many of these enormous vehicles there are around. I mean, the competition is going to be fierce. So just in terms of where next, do you think, for JLR? I mean, what's going to be the next point in this story?
Well, I think, the electrification program is set out. They've got the new Defender coming to market at the end of this year, which, a sort of updated version of their famous car, which should sell well. And the share price has rallied. Tata Motors shares recently, the JLR bonds have rallied too, because they actually managed to turn out a profit in the most recent quarter. So I think that's good. There will be speculation, though, that they could become still a takeover target. The management say they don't want to sell. Sorry, Tata says it doesn't want to sell, but I think given the attractions of the SUV demand, perhaps that could still happen.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks to Chris Bryant for that. So you can read more on this and other stories from Bloomberg Opinion, bloomberg.com/opinion, and on the terminal by typing OPIN GO.
With the Bloomberg Business of Sports Report, I'm Michael Barr. The Executive Vice President for Sports Sales at Fox Sports says it's a pinch-yourself moment. Seth Winter says Fox Sports has sold 80% of its Super Bowl commercials, resulting in a game of musical chairs for the remaining inventory. Winter says we went in with expectations that we would do well. We're pacing well ahead of where we thought we would be. The network has sold 60 of the 77 available spots at record prices of $5.5 million if an advertiser buys 2 30-second ads and $5.6 million if it takes just one. In comparison, CBS last year sold ads for $5.1 to $5.3 million. Winter also says the network will present 4 commercials per quarter, one fewer than in previous NFL championships, in an effort to create a more free-flowing viewer experience. And that is a Bloomberg Business of Sports Report. I'm Michael Barr, brought to you by the all-new gas-powered Sprinter from Mercedes-Benz. In-depth analysis, concise reporting, need-to-know global business news. Around the world and across the markets, Bloomberg connects the dots for decision makers. Stay on top of today's headlines. Follow big breakthroughs in tech. Understand the latest political issues. See how the world's wealthiest are spending their money. Track what's happening in the markets, and much more. Subscribe today to Bloomberg, the global standard for business reporting. Get it all at Bloomberg.com/subscriptions.
CIOs, did you know digital transformation starts with 3 simple letters? It's not API or IoT. It's GEP, innovative cloud-based procurement and supply chain software. GEP has hundreds of Fortune 500 and Global 2000 customers and smart, intuitive software products that business users love. 3 letters. GEP, leaders in unified procurement and supply chain solutions. GEP, helping the world's best companies do better.
We just got back from a beautiful city break in Bath. Midweek is the perfect time to beat the crowds. Just an hour and a half by train from London. It was so relaxing. We headed straight for Bath Christmas Market. Oh, I can still smell the roasted chestnuts and mulled wine from the chalets. Next, we donned our skates for Bath on Ice. I'm a natural. Didn't have to hold on to anything or anyone. There's so much to do in Bath. I'm already planning my next trip.
Discover the magic of Bath this Christmas. Plan ahead at visitbath.co.uk/Christmas.
If you're planning on driving this weekend, expect delays on the A406 North Circular Road. There'll be road closures between Edmonton and Tottenham from 10 p.m. on Friday the 15th of November to 5 a.m. on Monday the 18th of November, while we carry out essential maintenance and repairs. All roads in the surrounding area will be extremely busy, so please allow more time for your journey and expect delays in the area. Plan ahead and check alternative routes at tfl.gov.uk. To the Mayor of London and TfL, every journey matters.
O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and come to the shops with me. We can get 10% off 2 big shops a month with the new Tesco Club Card Plus. Oh, and 10% off your favourite Tesco brands, including F&F in-store every day. All for $7.99 a month.
New Tesco Club Card Plus. Value you can't stop talking about. Subscribe online today. £200 max spend per shop, in-store spend only. Club card app required, exclusions apply. See online for details.
This Black Friday, get Sky Entertainment for £22 a month, then feel it all with a spectacular 50% off Sky Sports, including the Manchester Derby and the darts. Build your perfect bundle today. Choose any or all of our Sky TV packages and get an incredible 50% off. Hurry, join today. Visit sky.com.
Offer ends 2nd of December. New 18-month minimum terms or 31 days notice to cancel depending on package. Discount on standard pricing with same minimum terms. Set up £25. Kit loaned at no cost.
Hi, I'm back. I just set a personal best on my park run. Feels great.
That's lovely, Mike. I think you've earned the right to put all the bins out.
Hey?
With Vitality Life Insurance, you get properly rewarded when you're active. In fact, you could save over £730 every year in discounts and rewards from our partners. Join over 1 million customers. Just search Vitality Life. Vitality. Positively different. Annual savings available with certain plans and are dependent on members' usage of rewards available. Terms and conditions apply.
Did you know your favorite radio stations are in your pocket? Yes, the TuneIn app lets you listen to the same radio stations you pick up on your home or car radio anywhere you want. To see all the stations broadcasting in your area, find the local radio section on the home screen. Keep it local with TuneIn.
Live to London on DAB Digital Radio, to New York, Bloomberg 1130, to Washington DC, Bloomberg 99.1, to Boston, Bloomberg 106.1, to San Francisco, Bloomberg 960, and around the globe, the Bloomberg Business app and BloombergRadio.com. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.
And it's 9:30 a.m. here in London, 10:30 in Berlin and across Europe. Good morning, I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Anna Edwards. You're listening to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. We check the data for you every 15 minutes here on Bloomberg Radio. So let's do that. We see European equity markets bouncing back up a little bit during this morning's session. US futures also point higher by between 3 and 0.4%. So the European equity market's up 0.4% on the Stock 600. The FTSE up 0.3. The CAC 40's up 0.7, and the Xetra DAX up 0.4. We see weakness in Scandinavia from SEB, that's one of the big fallers in the banking sector. Concerns around a forthcoming documentary around the banking sector and the Baltics that's coming in Scandinavia, and so that's having an impact there. More broadly, let's check some other assets for you. We've got oil prices a touch weaker, flat on WTI, Brent down 0.25%, 62.13 is where we trade on the Brent price. So we see money coming into stocks and out of bond markets, so as a result, yields going a little higher on US Treasuries. 1.8377 is where we trade on the US 10-year yield. The dollar is a little firmer. 98.229 is where we trade on the dollar index. We see weakness in the yen, as you might expect. It goes along with the risk-on mood in markets overnight. So the yen is down by 0.2%. No great moves on the pound, just retreating 0.1% against the US dollar. What's excited markets? What's lit the fire under equity markets and risk assets over the last 24 hours? Further news flow, it would seem, from Larry Kudlow this time around, Caroline, and what he expects from the trade deal. You employing a nice golfing metaphor, saying we're in the final strokes, I think, yes. In terms of getting that phase 1 trade deal done.
Yeah, so those are the markets. Now, let's talk about this really interesting story. So the European Investment Bank has adopted an unprecedented plan to end all funding for fossil fuel energy projects. With more than $500 billion in outstanding loans, the EIB is the biggest multilateral financial institution in the world, making this really a key part of the EU's moves to become the first climate neutral continent. And I'm pleased to say, joining us this morning down the line is the EIB Vice President for Energy, Andrew McDowell. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Look, why did the investment bank take this decision now? It wasn't an easy decision.
No, and good morning to you and your listeners. It hasn't been an easy decision. We've spent 9 months in consultation with the stakeholders of the institution, with the public, and obviously in recent months with our shareholders, who are the 28 member states of the European Union. And the proposition that we've put is that from both the policy and from a banking perspective, it makes no sense for us to continue to invest in 20 to 25-year assets that are going to be overtaken by new technologies and that do not deliver on the EU's very ambitious climate and energy targets. And in particular, we've had a difficult discussion, obviously, about the role of gas in this transition. And our proposition as a public financial institution is that for every euro we invest in gas is a euro we're not investing in renewable energy technologies and energy efficiency improvements that really are going to be part of the future and that make much more sense from both a policy and a banking perspective. So we're really delighted that yesterday our board of directors overwhelmingly, after a long process, supported the new energy lending policy of the bank and agreed that from the end of 2021 we will no longer finance unabated fossil fuel energy projects.
Let me ask you a little bit about the assessment you've made as to what this does to the returns for the European Investment Bank. I mean, clearly you have a mission that is far greater and broader than just about making solid returns. There are other things on your mind, such as climate change. But what kind of impact will this have? Are you sacrificing returns to make this decision, or do you think you can still keep up the level of return?
I mean, from a banking perspective, obviously we're a bank with a policy mission and we're publicly owned. But even from a banking perspective, and our statutes do require this institution to be run on a commercial basis. We need a return to be financially sustainable. But we think this makes sense from a banking perspective. Don't forget the average life of energy assets that we finance is at least 15 years, and in some cases up to 25 and 30 years. So we need to take a very long-term perspective as to which of those assets is still going to be performing and generating economic and financial value, not in 5 years' time, but in 25 years' time.
Yeah.
And when we look in the distant future, and we look already at the competitiveness of renewable energy, we see a future where renewables is really going to start dominating energy systems in the future. And even from a pure banking perspective, the EIB, like many other financial institutions, is increasingly worried about being left with stranded assets on its balance sheet, assets that have been overtaken by new technologies and can no longer compete. And that's why, even from a banking perspective, it makes sense for us to move away from fossil fuels.
Are the projects in this new sort of greener economy, which clearly Europe is trying to kind of stake a position in, are they there? Because obviously the EIB's impact is very much felt in terms of the lending strategies of other investors, and could sort of make others rethink. But are the green projects that Europe sort of really wants, are they actually there to invest in now?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And obviously that doesn't just depend on the availability of finance, that depends on policy. And that depends on ambitious policies being pursued by the European Union to create the right incentives for the private sector to invest in the green technologies and then come to the EIB and other institutions to look for the financing. We think things are moving in the right direction. So, for example, regulation is extremely important in areas like building standards. And we've seen, obviously, new, very ambitious building standard regulations being developed in Europe in the last 5 years. That's quadrupled our lending into energy efficiency. We also see, obviously, the impact of carbon pricing. So the reformed emissions trading system within Europe has effectively quadrupled the price of carbon in the last 2 years, from about €8 a tonne to slightly over €30 a tonne now. And we already see the impact of that with a lot more renewable energy projects coming forward.
So there's a lot more projects. Sorry, just carry on.
Please. No, I know. I mean, good policy generates good projects that we can bank.
Okay, so there are projects to invest in. Just briefly, there's a long-running conversation about the subject of whether to divest or whether to engage with businesses that pollute amongst the investment community, isn't there, Andrew? And I know this isn't. You're not talking about shareholders here. We're talking about the provision of other financing. But do you think you've answered that from the EIB's perspective? The answer is divest.
Well, I mean, we're a bank, so we provide, obviously, long-term debt. And obviously, whatever debt is already on our balance sheet from the fossil fuel sector remains there until it's repaid. So it's a different question for equity investors in publicly traded markets as to whether they hold or sell. But to answer your question about whether we're disengaging, I mean, we will continue to engage, for example, with the gas industry, but we want to see their own decarbonization plans. Gas, for example, as a technology, still has a role as an important energy store for the future to manage seasonal fluctuations between energy supply and energy demand. But the gas industry itself needs to look at its own decarbonization plans. The technologies are there, and we have said if the gas industry comes forward with projects such as highly efficient combined heat and power, carbon capture and storage, renewable gases, that these are technologies that we will continue to support. So we're not disengaging. We're basically saying we will put in place an incentive structure for the industry to come forward with better technologies, cleaner technologies for the future.
Okay, thank you for joining us this morning. That's Andrew McDowell, who's the EIB Vice President for Energy. A fascinating conversation about what this massive lender is doing in terms of pushing Europe into the green space. Let's get a little bit of world and national news. Bloomberg's Leanne Gaines is standing by. Good morning.
Good morning, Caroline. Let's start in Hong Kong. The months of protests have taken a toll on the financial hub. The city is now forecasting its first annual recession since a global financial crisis. That was a decade ago. The government says GDP will contract 1.3% in 2019 from last year. The grim outlook is in line with what is visible on Hong Kong's streets. Shopping malls, stores and restaurants are either shut or now on shorter hours. Meanwhile, here in the UK, the Labour Party has pledged to deliver free, full fibre broadband across the UK. That's within 10 years in what is the party's biggest new pledge of the election campaign. Labour says it would spend about £20 billion nationalising BT Group's Openreach unit. The opposition party has already said it wants the state to operate the postal service, railways, water and energy utilities. Labour is currently trailing the Conservatives by some 11%, according to Bloomberg's poll average. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg Anna.
Leanne, thank you. Coming up on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, Daniel Morris, Senior Investment Strategist at BNP Paribas, joins us next. We'll turn to the Fed, get his thoughts on some of the comments we've had about the US economy being in a good place. This is Bloomberg.
Okay, kids, Dad's gonna teach you how to dance. First, spread your feet apart. Then, pump your knee, nod your head, shake your hips, and bite your lip ever so slightly. Now, with one hand in the air, point at people with the other hand. I call that the rock star.
Dance like a dad. It's a great way to make a moment with your kids.
Now, make a face like it just smells something bad.
Visit fatherhood.gov. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Ad Council.
Investors who put their money on the line to help build U.S. infrastructure deserve to be protected. That's what we do at BAM. Our unconditional guarantee means investors receive every payment of interest and principal when due, period. BAM-insured bonds have a high AA stable rating from S&P, and BAM credit profiles provide complete transparency on each and every transaction. BAM-insured bonds help build America's essential public projects. BAM, the feeling is mutual.
Why is delivering the best client experience a top priority at BNY Mellon's Pershing? Michelle Feinstein, Director of Client Engagement, explains.
Today's investors want a financial relationship that's on demand, customized, and leverages the latest digital technology. At BNY Mellon's Pershing, helping advisory firms and broker-dealers create great experiences for their clients is our priority. Through our integrated wealth experience, we give you a high-touch service, flexible technology choices, and expert insights, so you can deliver a highly personalized experience to your clients at every step, from onboarding to wealth planning, to performance analysis and more. And because we're part of BNY Mellon, you'll benefit from more than 230 years of strength and stability. At Pershing, we're personally invested in your success.
Visit Pershing.com to learn more about Pershing's integrated wealth experience. Pershing LLC and Pershing Advisor Solutions LLC are both members of FINRA and SIPC.
'Tis the season to be hunched over your laptop. Not on our watch. In real life, you can feel your senses and your baskets. Feel all the sights, sounds, lols, and OMGs. Wear laughing emojis on actual smiley faces. Battery is running low. Take the kids to Santa's Grotto. In real life, you can find just the right present using the most advanced search engine in the world. Your eyes. We hunt in real life. Brent Cross, London. Free parking for all sleighs and cars.
If you're planning on driving this weekend, expect delays on the A406 North Circular Road. There'll be road closures between Edmonton and Tottenham from 10 p.m. on Friday the 15th of November to 5 a.m. on Monday the 18th of November, while we carry out essential maintenance and repairs. All roads in the surrounding area will be extremely busy, so please allow more time for your journey and expect delays in the area. Plan ahead and check alternative routes at tfl.gov.uk. To the Mayor of London and TfL, every journey matters.
Everybody needs somebody.
At Amazon, find everything you need to make the kids smile this Christmas. You can get items like the LOL Surprise 2-in-1 Glamper, Monopoly with electronic voice banking, and the Barbie 3-story townhouse. all with low prices and free UK delivery on eligible orders over £20. So there'll be more, and more.
Wow, thanks, Mum and Dad.
Amazon, delivering all you need for the kids for less.
O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and come to the shops with me. We can get 10% off 2 big shops a month with the new Tesco Club Card Plus. Oh, and 10% off your favourite Tesco brands, including F&F in-store every day. All for $7.99 a month.
New Tesco Club Card Plus. Value you can't stop talking about. Subscribe online today. £200 max spend per shop. In-store spend only. Club card app required. Exclusions apply. See online for details.
This is the sound of festive fun in London. You want to keep your savings for the things you love this Christmas, not a new boiler. We're with you. So our boilers come with 2 years interest-free credit to keep your savings for a Merry Christmas. You'll get a 5-year British Gas warranty, and now we can quote by video call evenings or weekends. Get a quote by the 30th of November and get £150 off a new boiler, or £450 off for existing home care customers. Search British Gas New Boiler. Conditions apply.
Gosh, can we put the heating on?
Sorry, it's broken.
Can I play some tunes on my phone then?
Yeah, afraid not. Play CDs, though.
This car belongs in a scrapyard.
I know, but I get nothing if I scrapped it.
Actually, you can get at least £2,000 off a new Ford for it.
Really?
With Ford's New for Old scrappage scheme, you can get between £2,000 and £4,250 off a new Ford car if you scrap an eligible vehicle with us responsibly. Also, there's 0% APR representative on Ford options. Ford. Together, we go further. Search Ford Scrappage. Exclusions apply. Contracted and registered by 31st of December 2019 at participating dealers. Age and ownership criteria apply to scrappage vehicle. Subject to status. Free post Ford credit.
This Black Friday, get Sky Entertainment for £22 a month, then feel it all with a spectacular 50% off Sky Sports, including the Manchester Derby and the darts. Build your perfect bundle today. Choose any or all of our Sky TV packages and get an incredible 50% off. Hurry, join today. Visit sky.com.
Offer ends 2nd of December. New 18-month minimum terms or 31 days notice to cancel depending on package. Discount on standard pricing with same minimum terms. Set up £25. Kit loaned at no cost.
It's Liz Hernandez with your TuneIn Music News Update.
Nick Jonas tells Insider.com that his wife Priyanka Chopra is his best teammate. Nick says, our schedule this early on in our marriage was kind of unexpected, but she's the best teammate in all that. Meanwhile, Selena Gomez tells USA Today that her new music is going to be different than her past efforts. Selena says, I definitely explored more with electric guitar, a lot of more soulful tracks, underneath things, acoustic guitar. For more music from Selena Gomez and Nick Jonas, search today's hits on TuneIn.
Markets, headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app and at TikTok on Twitter. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg's European headquarters here in London, I'm Caroline Hepker with this Bloomberg Radio Business Flash. So European stocks are climbing, up 0.4% on the US Stock 600. The Xetra DAX gains the same amount, 0.4% higher. In terms of individual companies that we're watching out for, Müller-Maersk, the world's biggest container shipping company, one of the stragglers reporting earnings today, sees a bleaker industry outlook because of the global trade wars. Their share price is flat right now. Interestingly, though, BT Group shares are up by 2.2%. That's after the Labour Party in the UK is talking about nationalising BT's Openreach arm or unit so that they can offer free full fibre broadband across the country. That is if they win the general election in December. BT's boss hitting back, saying that Labour's estimates of how much it will cost are vastly an underestimate. Labour saying 20 billion, the company boss saying more like 100 billion. As for the rest of the markets, it's really all around this renewed trade deal optimism that we've seen equity markets head higher. The MSCI Asia Pacific up by 0.5%, for example, and also US futures right now heading higher, up by 0.3% on the S&P 500 in terms of futures. As for the FX space, we trade at 1.83% for US benchmark yields, gaining 2 basis points at the moment. The PBOC also added a bit of liquidity into the markets this morning, although not quite as much as some market participants had wanted, and kept interest rates unchanged at 3.25%. So China's yuan, amidst sort of this trade war discussion, it strengthens 0.1%, trading at 7.01. The euro is slightly weaker, 1.10. The pound at 128.76. So those are the markets. That is a with Bloomberg Business Flash. Now here's Leanne Gerrans with more what's going on around the world.
Caroline, good morning. 2 students have been killed and 3 others injured by a gunman who opened fire at a secondary school in California, officials say. The shooting took place at Saugus High School in Santa Clarita minutes before the school day was due to begin. A 16-year-old male suspect who was also injured was taken into custody. A state of emergency has been declared in Venice as the historic city deals with the worst flooding in more than 50 years. There's anger from locals that a huge underwater defense barrier still hasn't been finished. Italy's Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte has chaired a special cabinet meeting after visiting the city. And finally, can she shake it off? Taylor Swift is accusing her former record label of stopping her performing her old songs. The escalating dispute with powerful celebrity manager Scooter Braun and the singer-songwriter tweeted a plea asking fans and asset management firm Carlyle Group to help her secure ownership of 6 albums she recorded under the Big Machine label. This disagreement means she might not be able to go ahead with an upcoming set at the American Music Awards and a Netflix documentary about her life. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg Anna.
Leanne, thank you very much. Coming up next, our colleagues in the US are getting ready for Bloomberg Daybreak. Let's check in with Nathan Hager, who is standing by for us. Nathan, good morning. And it seems Larry Kudlow's reference to golf has done the trick, boosted the markets.
Right. The phrase of the day, I think you're alluding to there, Anna, is short strokes. And that's where the White House says the U.S. and China are when it comes to finally hammering out a phase 1 trade deal that it seems like they've been saying for weeks, if not months, that they're very close to. But we are seeing a lift to market sentiment this morning. But what about longer term? We're hearing from some financial heavyweights warning that deeper trade tensions between the world's 2 largest economies could persist for decades. We're going to check in with the chief U.S. economist at TS Lombard on this. Steve Blitz will join us. We also await another indicator of the health of the U.S. consumer. We'll preview October retail sales with Yelena Shulyecheva of Bloomberg Economics. And we're getting ready for the next round of impeachment hearings. Those begin in just a few hours with lawmakers hearing from the former Ukraine ambassador who says she was the victim of a smear campaign. Join me and Karen Moscow for all that coming up as we work on our short game on Bloomberg Daybreak. Anna.
Yes. Well, you could do that whilst broadcasting, I suppose.
Sure.
It is radio, after all.
Absolutely.
Fabulous. Thanks very much, Nathan. Up next, Nathan Hager and the team on Bloomberg Daybreak. Or if you're listening on London DAB Digital Radio, you'll hear Bloomberg Surveillance.
Now, let's talk about the Fed. The Fed Chair Jay Powell called the US economy a, quote, star performer on his second day of congressional testimony. His upbeat views round off a week in which officials have painted a positive picture of the US economy, reinforcing that monetary policy is set to be on hold for a prolonged period.
The U.S. economy is the star economy these days. We're growing at 2%, right in that range. So more than any of the other advanced economies are growing, and there's no reason to think that can't continue.
The policy accommodation we've taken, which has been 3 rate cuts this year, has put policy stance in a very good place to make that baseline come out where we need it to.
The economy is in a good place, and monetary policy is as well. My forecast is for moderate GDP growth, the labor market remaining strong, and inflation moving back to our symmetric 2% target.
U.S. inflation expectations today do reside at the low end of a range I consider consistent with our price stability mandate.
There's no reason to think that I can see that the probability of a recession is at all elevated at this time.
So that was the Fed Chair Jay Powell, San Francisco's Mary Daly, New York's John Williams, and Fed Vice Chair Richard Clarida. So a bit of a look back at this week. Now, joining us in our studio here is Daniel Morris, Senior Investment Strategist at BNP Paribas. Warm welcome to the programme. Really to look over the markets this week. You say that markets are disappointed that Powell didn't signal more rate cuts, but actually the Fed's view is fairly justified. So it's a star performer, gold star for the US economy?
Well, I guess when you have the other countries to compare it to, particularly Europe, it's not a particularly high bar to say that it's a star performer. 2%, yeah, that's also above trend for the U.S. It's above the long-run potential growth rate. So from that point of view, it is certainly fine, and that's one of the Fed's objectives. What they're not talking about, though, is inflation, that even inflation is still below target. Of course, they say that it's going to be moving back to their 2% target level, but they always do say that. And if you look at the most recent data that we had for personal consumption expenditures, which is the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, that actually ticked down. So it's not clear that even if the economy is growing at a good pace, that inflation is moving back towards target, and then that raises the question whether in fact they actually should be contemplating further cuts in interest rates.
Another big question for the US economy is the extent to which the downturn in manufacturing infects the consumer, and of course the latter matters much more in percentage terms for the US story. I was looking at a Bloomberg consumer confidence measure that seemed to be ticking downwards. It had had a very strong run. We get US retail sales a little bit later on today. Do you expect that kind of cross-contamination from manufacturing, or do you think the consumer remains resilient?
We think the consumer is resilient. It's quite difficult, frankly, to go as far as the tariffs that have been put on just Chinese imports, because remember, the tariffs are only on Chinese imports. You know, the U.S. does import goods quite a bit from Europe, for that matter.
So far, untariffed.
So, that could change.
Well, no new tariffs anyway.
So you're not affecting certainly all of the manufacturing base, and of course, a relatively small percentage of the labor force is working in manufacturing, so it's a small slice. And so even if you do clearly have a downturn in that part of the economy, for it to spread more broadly, certainly at this point seems unlikely. It's not something that we're anticipating, and we do think growth can continue, as Powell said, at around a 2% pace.
Are there attractive investments here in Europe? Obviously, we've talked about the relative strength of the US. This in a week where we've seen Germany avoid a technical recession, but then that actually kind of meaning that there may not be stimulus from the government in Germany, which is very much hoped for by the ECB and others as a way of trying to boost Europe.
Well, when you look at Europe, I think the challenge now is having to find the sectors, I think, where you see more growth potential. In the U.S., if you're just looking at, say, the S&P 500, I think you can have reasonably optimistic forecasts for earnings growth for the next year. For Stock 600 or MSCI Europe, it's a little more challenging because there's much more diversity across the sectors, or range of returns, an outlook across the sectors in Europe. So what we've seen in this current earnings season is that it's been in industrials and consumer sectors where you've actually had reasonably good earnings growth. Very poor numbers, though, in energy and materials and some of the defensive sectors. So I think it's selective. There are opportunities, as always, but we think it's more focused in the cyclical sectors and the consumer-oriented domestic sectors than necessarily tradable goods.
Daniel, how do you position around the UK election? Still some time until December the 12th, of course. But I suppose a lot rides on who ends up in power, but also a lot rides on the extent of a majority or not, and whether we get any certainty in a path ahead. I suppose that's key.
Yeah, so our position is to be more or less neutral at this point, simply because there are so many possibilities that can come out of this, so many different variations and permutations, and so to try to have a view on what things might look like in 2 months or 6 months, we think is perhaps foolhardy. So we think you've seen already a pretty strong rally clearly in the pound over the last several months. We think that's reflecting a much lower risk of an actual no-deal Brexit. We think that's appropriate, but what comes next and then what that means for the currency and for the economy, it's anyone's guess.
Anyone's guess, okay. What about the stock versus bonds question? Very briefly, equity risk premium, is it at a crisis level now?
Not a crisis level, but I think there is a dilemma. Well, frankly, that you can argue that both equities and bonds are at high valuations, right? So what is your expected total return over the next year? Treasuries, at best 2%, whereas in equities, we think you still will do better than that. So in terms of a high-level asset allocation, we are still overweight equities.
Daniel, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Daniel Morris, Senior Investment Strategist at BNP Paribas.
And in the next hour, it's Daybreak with Nathan Hager and Karen Moscow here on Bloomberg Radio. If you're listening on London DAB, though, you will hear Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keane and Francine Lacroix. This is Bloomberg.
We just got back from a beautiful city break in Bath. Midweek is the perfect time to beat the crowds. Just an hour and a half by train from London. It was so relaxing. We headed straight for Bath Christmas Market. Oh, I can still smell the roasted chestnuts and mulled wine from the chalets. We dropped off our Christmas shopping at the hotel. Then it was off to be spellbound at the Theatre Royal Bath. There's so much to do in Bath. I'm already planning my next trip.
Discover the magic of Bath this Christmas. Plan ahead at visitbath.co.uk/Christmas.
Just because you travel doesn't mean you can't keep your routine. The more obstacles travel puts between us and our well-being, the more we strive to work well. At Westin Hotels and Resorts, we're focused on empowering your well-being. With Westin Meetings, you work and feel your best with nutritious snacks and nourishing smoothies that give you the energy you need to power through any meeting. Don't leave your well-being behind. We give you the choice to get up or to rise. Search Westin online to find out more. Westin, let's rise.
Wiper blades on such a wet Friday morning as this. Squeaky, streaky. Rain rattles your windscreen, smears rattle your confidence. Can't see, can't drive. Can't believe you haven't been to Halfords yet. Come to Halfords. We fit new wiper blades on the spot from just £3. And we're open late 7 days a week. See halfords.com for opening hours. Here in Wandsworth. Ready for winter's worst? Ready for anything. Halfords, for life's journeys.
Wiper blades sold separately. Selected vehicles only in most stores.
Financial capital of the world, 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on the Bloomberg Business app, and at TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg Radio.
Live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers Studios, this is Bloomberg Daybreak for Friday, November 15th, 2019. Coming up this hour.
U.S. futures climb as the White House signals progress on trade talks with China.
We also have notes of caution, including a warning the conflict could drag on for decades.
Protests continue in Hong Kong as the city braces for its first recession since the financial crisis.
The former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine testifies today in the public impeachment inquiry hearing, plus more on the shooting at a Los Angeles area high school. I'm Michael Barr. More ahead.
I'm John Stashower in sports. The Knicks beat Kristaps Porzingis and the Mavs. The Nets lost in Denver. The Rangers lost in Tampa. And in the NFL, the Browns beat the Steelers.
That's all straight ahead on Bloomberg Daybreak. On Bloomberg 1130 New York, Bloomberg 99.1 Washington, D.C., Bloomberg 106.1 Boston, Bloomberg 960 San Francisco, Sirius XM 119, and around the world on BloombergRadio.com and via the Bloomberg Business app.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow, and U.S. futures are higher this morning as we head into the final trading day of the week. We're coming up to 5:01 on Wall Street, and we check the markets every 15 minutes throughout the trading day on Bloomberg. S&P futures up 10 points this morning. Dow futures up 92. NASDAQ futures up 36. The DAX in Germany is up 0.4%. CAC in Paris up 0.7%. FTSE 100 up 0.3%. Nikkei 225 in Japan jumped 0.7%, and the Hang Seng in Hong Kong was little changed. 10-year Treasury down 7/30 seconds, yield 1.84%. Yield on the 2-year, 1.61%. NYMEX crude oil down 0.1% or 8 cents at 56.69 a barrel. COMEX gold is down 0.6% or $9.20 at 14.6420 an ounce. The euro 1.1020 against the dollar. The yen 108.68. Nathan.
Hey, Karen, we're getting positive signs this morning on trade talks from the White House, but some big names in finance are also sounding a cautious tone. First, Larry Kudlow says negotiations on a Phase 1 deal are coming down to the final stages. An agreement is close, but not done, according to the White House economic advisor. At the same time, titans of industry like Alibaba founder Jack Ma warned that the U.S.-China relationship will face turmoil for decades, even after a short-term deal is signed. Jack Ma spoke exclusively to Bloomberg.
I say USA and China relationship might be in some turbulence in 20 years. Next 20 years may last. We have to be very, very careful.
Jack Ma's Alibaba is one of Asia's biggest companies and has so far weathered the trade war better than some, thanks to booming online consumption in China.
The man behind the world's biggest hedge fund is also issuing a warning. Bridgewater Associates founder Ray Dalio says the U.S.-China conflict has the potential to expand beyond trade. He warns of a capital war between the world's largest economies.
There's a trade war. There's a technology war. There is a geopolitical war. And there could be capital wars. And that is the nature of the environment. And how that's approached is going to determine what our futures are like.
Delio spoke at the annual gala for the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. His comments come as lawmakers like Senator Marco Rubio warn that investment in China undermines national security.
Now, despite those concerns, investors like what they're hearing from the White House. Suggestions of progress in trade talks helped stocks in Asia finish today's session with gains. Bloomberg's Juliet Sally joins us with details from Singapore. Juliet, good morning.
Good morning, Nathan and Karen. Equities rose in Tokyo, Sydney and Seoul, while the won gained against the dollar, and the Aussie and Kiwi were also bid as exporters snapped up the commodity currencies amid fear they may have to pay higher levels for spot next week in the event a deal is agreed to over the weekend. However, equities in mainland China fell after the PBOC kept its key interest rate unchanged at 3.25%, despite a surprise $29 billion injection into the banking system through one-year loans to banks. In Singapore, I'm Juliet Sali, Bloomberg Daybreak.
All right, Juliet, thank you. Stocks in Hong Kong stabilized today. The Hang Seng closed little change despite a fifth day of demonstrations and the second death resulting from protests. A 70-year-old government worker struck by a brick has died of his injuries. Police classify the death as a murder. Ben Bland is director of the Southeast Asia Project at the Lowy Institute.
When you see a conflict like this escalating, it's really hard to see a way out. When you talk to democracy activists, they'll say they don't have an off-ramp because they're calling for change, but they're not in government. They don't have the power to do anything about it. And I do think it's hard to see anything other than a continuing escalation, unfortunately, which is what we're seeing on the streets, and that's got to be our most likely expectation for what's going to happen going forward.
Now Hong Kong expects its first annual recession since the financial crisis. The city is revising its estimate for growth, forecasting the economy will contract 1.3% this year.
Turning to U.S. markets now, we're learning more about what stocks drew the most investment in the third quarter as money managers file 13F forms with the SEC. Here with the details is Bloomberg's Doug Krisner.
Major funds bought shares in Facebook and Netflix despite steep declines during the quarter. Harvard's endowment added 2 million Facebook shares. Facebook was down 8% in the period. Among hedge funds, Lone Pine Capital, along with Maverick and D1, all started new stakes in Netflix or added to the ones they had. Netflix fell 27% in Q3. Among legendary investors, Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway reported new common equity stakes in Occidental Petroleum, while Berkshire trimmed bets on Apple and Wells Fargo, and Stan Druckenmiller's Duquesne family office offloaded nearly its entire stake in Uber. I'm Doug Krisner, Bloomberg Daybreak.
Doug, thank you. On the economic front, we get a reading on U.S. retail sales today. Forecasts call for an increase of 0.3% in October. And here with a preview is Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Bloomberg Economics says slower income growth could point to moderating consumer spending. In September, for example, retail sales dropped for the first time since February, with 7 of 13 major categories posting declines. Also on today's data calendar, October industrial production, which has been hobbled by White House tariffs and slower global growth. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Daybreak.
All right, Vinny, thanks. Now let's take a look at some of the most active stocks in early trading. Now, shares of Applied Materials are up more than 4.5% after earnings that topped estimates, and that's giving a lift to other semiconductor stocks. AMD and Qualcomm are both higher by about 1%. Shares of Occidental Petroleum are 2% higher following word of that investment from Warren Buffett last quarter. And Grubhub with a gain of about 4.5%, getting a lift from news that Shake Shack will begin using the service for nationwide delivery. And those are some of the movers in the pre-market this morning. Bloomberg customers can check out the early equity action by typing most U4GO on the terminal. And S&P futures are higher by 9 points. Straight ahead, the latest world and national news. This is Bloomberg. And it's 5:07 on Wall Street. Let's bring in Michael Barr to get a check of what's going on around the world. Good Friday morning, Michael.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Good morning to you. The House will hear from a witness today in the impeachment inquiry hearings. Marie Yovanovitch, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, was targeted by President Trump's allies for removal. Meanwhile, at a rally in Louisiana, the president says he has not done anything wrong.
The absolutely crazed lunatics, the Democrats, radical left, and their media partners standing right back there, are pushing the deranged impeachment witch hunt for doing nothing wrong. Doing nothing wrong.
Today is the second day of public impeachment inquiry hearings. Rudy Giuliani, President Trump's personal lawyer, is being investigated by federal prosecutors for possible campaign finance violations. According to 3 U.S. officials, Giuliani is also accused of not registering as a foreign agent as part of an active investigation into his financial dealings. President Trump is asking the U.S. Supreme Court to keep his tax returns from being turned over to a New York prosecutor. Bloomberg's Bob Moon reports a win could give presidents broad immunity while in office.
The case is straightforward. District Attorney Cyrus Vance is investigating whether the Trump Organization falsified records to disguise hush payments to 2 women who claim they had sex with Trump. He argues he's fighting a politically motivated subpoena that seeks highly intrusive records and could interfere with his work as president. A federal appeals court ruled the president can't block compliance simply because he's president, noting the subpoena is directed at his accountants, so he's not required to attend court or do anything at all. Trump asked fast-track consideration to be heard in the 9-month term that ends in late June. Bob Moon, Bloomberg Daybreak.
Investigators are trying to determine why a 16-year-old suspect pulled a gun at the Los Angeles area high school campus, killing 2 students and wounding 3 before turning the gun on himself. It happened yesterday morning at Saugus High School in Santa Clarita. Los Angeles County Sheriff's Captain Ken Wegner says the shooting happened so quickly.
From the time that he withdrew the handgun from his backpack to the time that he was on the ground with a gunshot wound to his head was about 16 seconds.
Authorities say the teen gunman is hospitalized in critical condition. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at TikTok, on Twitter. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Michael Barr. This is Bloomberg, Nathan.
Thank you, Michael. 5:09 on Wall Street. Time for the Bloomberg NBC Sports Update. Here's John Stashower.
Nathan, it was about 10 months ago that Kristaps Porzingis told the Knicks that when he returned from his knee injury, he wanted to play for a different team. Traded to Dallas, his first trip back to the Garden, not surprisingly, booed throughout, and the Knicks have found a team they can defeat. 2 wins over the Mavs. Knicks are 1-9 against everyone else. They beat Dallas 106-103 on a late 3-point shot by Marcus Morris. Porzingis, once the Knicks teammate of Carmelo Anthony, he has found a job after being unemployed the past year. Anthony signed with Portland. The Nets, for the second straight game, outscored by 20 in the second half. They lost in Denver 101-93. A long night for the Rangers, a 9-3 loss at Tampa Bay. It was 4-0 just 7 minutes in. NFL Week 11, Cleveland over Pittsburgh 21-7. The bigger story, the wild fight that broke out with 8 seconds left. The Browns' Myles Garrett ripped the helmet off Steelers quarterback Mason Rudolph, then threw the helmet at Rudolph. Pittsburgh's Marquise Pouncey retaliated. It got ugly. Later, Garrett had calmed down.
It's going to come back to hurt our team. The guys who jumped in the little scrum, I appreciate my team having my back, but it just never got to that point. That's on me.
Suspension certainly to come. Mike Trout has never won a postseason game with the Angels. Has only appeared in the postseason once. It has not hurt him in terms of winning MVPs. Trout won in the American League for the 3rd time. He has finished second 4 other times. The Dodgers' Cody Bellinger won NL MVP. With the Bloomberg NBC Sports Update, I'm John Stashower. Nathan?
All right, John, thank you. Tune in tonight for the Bloomberg Business of Sports show when we hear from one of the most powerful women at Nike. Catch a conversation with Heidi O'Neill, who runs Nike's entire retail strategy, tonight at 8 and tomorrow at 11 a.m. on Bloomberg Radio. And subscribe to Bloomberg Business of Sports wherever you get your podcasts. S&P futures are higher this morning by 9.5 points. Dow futures a gain of 88 points. NASDAQ futures up by 34 points. You're listening to Bloomberg Daybreak.
Asset managers who seize change to launch new strategies, add distribution channels, or exploit new technology to re-engineer the investor experience are often rewarded. However, in an industry paralyzed with complexity, few act with agility or decisively. Few run their businesses strategically, yet the most competitive managers in the market know with the right partner and a flexible operating system, you can. Go boldly toward change with SCI Investment Manager Services.
Determination and operational strength are both essential factors for growth in asset management. I'm
Steve Meyer, President and Head of SEI's Investment Manager Services Division. We know that disruptive forces create opportunities around the world. If you see potential in change, our industry specialists will maximize SEI's integrated platform of data and risk management, global investment operations, compliance support, and investor services to position your asset management business for success. Come grow with us.
With SEI Investment Manager Services, you lead the charge in a competitive marketplace. Learn more at SEIC.com/C's Chain.
Business is constantly evolving. Is your financial printer evolving to keep ahead of the curve? At Command Financial, we are redefining financial printing by providing industry-leading expertise, leveraging technology, and honing processes and best practices. Every day, Command helps SEC registrants, as well as members of their working groups, including securities attorneys and investment bankers, prepare, file, and disseminate regulatory and disclosure documents, such as registration statements, M&A documents, and mutual fund prospectuses and reports. Command provides a full range of services to help you effectively complete your deal, meet your disclosure requirements, and achieve your shareholder communications objectives. Visit our website at commandfinancial.com and learn how we're evolving, not only with the times, but also with your business requirements. Command Financial, redefining financial printing.
Imagine being denied.
We just got back from a beautiful city break in Bath. Midweek is the perfect time to beat the crowds. Just an hour and a half by train from London. It was so relaxing. We headed straight for Bath Christmas Market. Oh, I can still smell the roasted chestnuts and mulled wine from the chalets. Next, we donned our skates for Bath on Ice. I'm a natural. Didn't have to hold on to anything. Or anyone. There's so much to do in Bath. I'm already planning my next trip.
Discover the magic of Bath this Christmas. Plan ahead at visitbath.co.uk/Christmas.
If you're planning on driving this weekend, expect delays on the A406 North Circular Road. There'll be road closures between Edmonton and Tottenham from 10 p.m. on Friday the 15th of November to 5 a.m. on Monday the 18th of November, while we carry out essential maintenance and repairs. All roads in the surrounding area will be extremely busy, so please allow more time for your journey and expect delays in the area. Plan ahead and check alternative routes at tfl.gov.uk. To the Mayor of London and TfL, every journey matters.
At Asda this Christmas, treat them to a gift or two, or three, with 3 for 2 on a wide range of beauty and toiletry gift sets, from Dove, Lynx, Bayliss and Harding and many more. Asda, let's make Christmas extra special. Selected stores and lines subject to availability. Individual prices £1 to £20. Cheapest item free.
Coffee shop, cashback, cat flaps, cashback, beanbags, rucksack, hire car, buy a car, flapjack, cashback, dumbbells, cashback, takeaway, holiday to anywhere the sun is at, bum bag, laptop, big match, hatchback, binge watching, paintballing, crab fishing, cashback, anything you want to buy, everywhere you want to go. Guess what? Cashback. Whatever you spend your money on, get money back every time with the American Express Platinum Cashback Everyday Credit Card. Search Amex Cashback. Representative 22.9% APR variable. Minimum annual spend to receive cashback. Terms apply. 18 plus subject to approval.
Influential conversations from Bloomberg Television. Here's Taylor Briggs.
A few former Uber employees have created a new startup, Virtual Kitchen. It's one of many entrants into the crowded field of companies renting kitchen space to restaurants desperate to satisfy demand from hungry homebodies. But it's particularly noteworthy that the founders came from Uber. Joining us to discuss the space, it is Ken Chong. He's the CEO of Virtual Kitchens. As we know, hugely crowded space. How do you stand out?
Thank you, Taylor. It's a pleasure to be here today. Food delivery is really popular. Consumers continue to love the convenience of it. And we talked to a lot of restaurateurs, and it turns out it's actually very challenging for restaurants who are built for dine-in first with a lot of seating. And so with Virtual Kitchen, we really are trying to make it seamless and turnkey for restaurateurs to expand delivery in a very simple way and with very little upfront costs. And of course, bring more selection and great food to more customers.
And you left Uber and Uber Eats in part because you saw the strain that the delivery apps were putting on those restaurants. How are you solving for that strain with your new virtual kitchen?
We build space, operations, and offer help on staffing, menu, and site selection to help them do the best delivery sort of product possible.
Hear more interviews like this one on Bloomberg Television, streaming live on Bloomberg.com and on the Bloomberg mobile app, or check your local cable listings. Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and TikTok on Twitter. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm Karen Moscow. European and Asian stocks climbing alongside U.S. stock index futures after a senior U.S. official signaled progress on a trade deal between the world's two largest economies. And we check the markets every 15 minutes throughout the trading day on Bloomberg. S&P futures up 10 points, Dow futures up 88, NASDAQ futures up 34. The DAX in Germany's up 0.4%. 10-year Treasury down 6/32, yield 1.83%, yield on the 2-year 1.60%. NYMEX crude oil is down 0.5% or 30 cents at $56.47 a barrel. COMEX gold is down 0.6% or $8.40 at $14.65 an ounce. The euro 1.1021 against the dollar, British pound 1.2874, and the yen at 108.66. And today we're looking for a report on retail sales at 8:30 Wall Street time, along with the import price index and New York manufacturing. At 9:15, it's industrial production and capacity utilization. Then at 10, business inventories. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now here's Michael Barr with more on what's going on around the world. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Day 2 of the public impeachment hearings get underway this morning. Taking center stage and taking questions from House lawmakers would be the former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. Investigators say the Los Angeles area high school student who opened fire on classmates on his 16th birthday seemed to target people at random. 2 teenagers were killed and 3 others wounded at yesterday's shooting at Saugus High School. The alleged gunman is in critical condition after shooting himself in the head. In the NBA, the Knicks won, the Nets lost. Thursday night football, the Browns beat the Steelers 21-7, but the game was marred by an ugly brawl when Myles Garrett snatched Mason Rudolph's helmet off and then clubbed him with it on his head. In the NHL, the Rangers lost. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok on Twitter. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Michael Barr. This is Bloomberg. Nathan.
All right, Michael. Thank you. 5:19 now on Wall Street. Live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers Studios. This is Bloomberg Daybreak. And our guest on this Friday morning is Steve Blitz, Chief U.S. Economist at T.S. Lombard. So, Steve, we've got this latest signal from the White House that the U.S. and China are in the short strokes when it comes to a phase 1 deal. At the same time, we've heard in the past from the president that if he doesn't get a deal, he's going to raise tariffs significantly. Where does this leave things now? Where is the messaging?
Well, that's a good question. Where's the messaging? And look, I just take this as a bit of a good cop, bad cop type of a story. I don't think that Trump's comments are really to be thought of as a real indication of where of how the actual negotiations are going. I think he's just out there saying these things to just make sure that China and everyone knows that there's a timeline here to make sure things go along. But I don't think anybody should look at it, those comments as saying that the negotiations are starting to fall apart.
All right, so where do you see the timeline at this point? Do you think it gets done before the end of the year?
Yeah, I would think so. I would think they'd like to get it done before the year. I think that Trump would needs it. I think the economy needs it. I think that this idea that it can wait all the way to the convention next year or just before the election, that kind of narrative is really a false narrative. I mean, the U.S. economy right now is beginning to feel the weight from the tightening of financial conditions at the end of last year. The Fed has since eased. We've got back to a positive curve. And going forward, that should help the economy as 2020 goes on. But we need to lift the weight of these tariffs in order to help to get the economy really turning back, accelerating again in terms of growth. And the key thing is how people view the economy in July is essentially how they voted in November. So you really need, the Republicans really need a stronger economy in the first half of the year And obviously a trade deal goes a long way in helping to ensure that.
At the same time, we heard comments on Capitol Hill from Fed Chairman Jerome Powell saying he doesn't see any reason why the U.S. economy, at least, shouldn't keep growing. Is he right?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's growing, right? So, and growing, I mean, there's in the sense of growing of a positive GDP number and say averaging 1.5 to 2% growth, something like that. Yeah, he's absolutely right. But he's going to have a year next year also where inflation and wage growth is probably going to be weaker than it was this year, simply because they tend to lag the economy by about a year. You have weaker earnings this year, so you'll have weaker wage growth next year, and you'll have somewhat weaker price growth as well, not only because wage growth will be weaker. Jobs growth is going to be weaker. It's going to be 100,000 as opposed to 200,000. And, you know, so those two alone is going to give you that kind of economy, which is, you know, it's positive, but it's not the kind of acceleration that Trump would probably like to see, especially something built on a renewal of business capital spending.
We've heard concern from a number of market participants, not the least of whom Jack Ma and Ray Dalio, warning that a long-term tension between the U.S. and China could persist even after a Phase 1 trade deal is made. Do you share that concern?
Oh, yeah. I don't think this is. I think the way to view Phase 1 is this is what they can agree on, as opposed to the other 1,000 things or whatever the number is that they can't agree on. So I think it's positive to say, look, we're going to sign an agreement on what we can agree on. We agree on what we can't agree on, and we'll keep going. The point is that Dalio and others are making is that some of these issues that they don't agree on, such as technology, the Huawei story, which is the 5G, and these are issues that are at least at this moment, somewhat intractable in terms of trying to find a solution. That's not to say that you can't find one a year, 18 months, or 2 years down the line. And what would help, though, is rather than wait to get the all-encompassing deal done, get the smaller deals done and see whether or not both sides hold to the agreement. And if they do, then you got a little bit more trust to build the next one.
Steve Blitz, always good talking with you. Thanks for this. Steve Blitz is Chief U.S. Economist at T.S. Lombard. With the White House saying the first phase trade deals in the short strokes, S&P futures are